call the June 2nd, 2011, what is this, a special council meeting agenda to order. Will you please rise with me for the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Please call the roll.
Councilmember Francisco, Hotchkiss. House.
Here.
Rouse.
Here.
Self. White.
Here.
Mayor Schneider.
Here. Is there public comment for items not on the agenda? Okay, I'm going to be nice to a Parks and Rec commissioner and let him come up now for his, because he has to run off, and just as acknowledgement for your hard work as all the work on Parks and Rec, we're going to let you do your public comment right now, and the others will have to wait till after the presentation. Thank you. Mr. K-Spear.
Thank you very much, Mayor Snyder and fellow council members. I stand before you in support of Santa Barbara Rental Mediation Task Force. I've been a real estate broker for over 35 years. During this period of time, I've managed many units, residential properties. On occasion, we have problems between tenants and landlords. There is so much misinformation and misinterpretation of laws. And I will tell you that I have called upon Andrea Bufano and her staff at the task force to intercede and to help the parties come together and resolve their differences. The vast majority of times, without a hearing, without, just giving good, solid information. And I believe that the investment you can make in this task force is the best bang for the buck you will ever find for all the residents of Santa Barbara. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we'll move on to staff presentation. Mr. Armstrong.
Yes, Madam Mayor and members of the City Council, we're now entering into the home stretch of the budget deliberations. And our goal over the next week is really to try and get final direction from the City Council in a number of areas. Today our focus will be on the general fund, on the issues that have come up during your deliberations, and especially consideration about the police department and staffing at the police department. We're hoping today to get final direction from you so we can go forward and finalize the general fund. Next Monday, we will have another session, and it will concentrate solely on solid waste rates and the direction we received from you when we considered those before about alternative rate structures compared to what has initially been recommended. And then next Thursday on June the 9th, our goal is to talk about redevelopment capital projects and try and finalize where we're going with redevelopment capital, and also to try and tighten that up so if there are some changes to state law that we've got more firm direction in terms of the projects we're going to go forward with. So that's kind of the plan, but again today the focus is on the general fund. And I think probably the two areas of concentration will be the rental housing mediation task force, where we'll need direction, and then also in the police staffing. So I've asked Bob to go over kind of the overall budget, the staff recommended adjustments, the finance committee's recommendations, and then I'll talk about the police staffing issue.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, members of council. Bob Samario, Finance Director. So here is our outline for today. We are going to get into the Finance Committee's recommendations. We'll talk about some of the adjustments stemming from the departmental review meetings that we've had and essentially what we heard. And then, as Mr. Armstrong indicated, talk about the proposed enhanced funding for police. And then we'll give you a recap of all the recommendations and then look for some final direction from council. So starting with Finance Committee recommendations, we did have some staff recommended adjustments that we presented to them. These are adjustments that arise out of the fact that when we adopt a budget in April, sometimes new information comes in. We have some technical adjustments to make. And so we bring those forward to the Finance Committee, and they make a recommendation, and we bring them to you as well. And I'm going to go through these fairly quickly. Again, we went over them in detail with the Finance Committee. They're fairly uncomplicated items. So we'll start with the first, City Administrator's Office. In City TV, they're going to be doing provide some services to City College, taping their meetings, and they're going to actually generate some revenues from that service of $6,500. So they are making an adjustment to the budget to recognize those revenues that are going to be funding hourly support or hourly salaries. In the fire department, you'll see a reduction of cost. This is a cost that's allocated from the Internal Service Fund for the maintenance of what are called the mobile data computers. For some reason, over the last several years, 100% of those costs have been allocated to the fire department, even though they relate also to the police department. And you can see below that we're essentially shifting from the fire department $53,000 for the share related to the police down to the bottom under police. So it's just a reallocation of costs related to the mobile data computers that are maintained by ICS. I'm going to skip the next one, go down to the police department. The one other item there is an increased funding from the RDA for restorative policing efforts, and we'll talk more about that. That's to enhance the amount that we included in the proposed budget of about $134. And so this is going to come from the RDA, $217,000. And then down below, you'll see the Public Works Department. They implemented a reorganization that's going to be effective next year, whereby the traffic operations are going to be moved over to the engineering division under Pat Kelly, the city's engineer. And with that, we're going to shift part of Pat Kelly's time, 20%, from the general fund to the streets fund, and that amounts to $43,000. So we're going to reduce the cost in the general fund. And you can see up above, non-departmental, we're going to move those savings into the appropriated reserves. So that no impact on the bottom line, just a shift of those savings to appropriated reserves.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
The $217,000 for the redevelopment agency, during that proposal, I was remembering more close to 300-something thousand. So what's the difference?
Yeah, so in the proposed budget, Madam Mayor, we had $134,000 already in there.
This is the additional
so this is going to
amount.
add to that, and you'll
Thank
see
you.
that a little bit later.
Thank you.
In the county library fund, these were the adjustments that were were recommended and presented to the finance committee. The next slide, you'll see that they've actually made some additional tweaks to that. But what's happening is that they're going to see reduced funding from the Carpinteria Friends of the Library of $15,000. And the way they were going to balance that out was to reduce their book acquisitions by $7,500 and hourly salaries by $7,500. In addition to that, they are going to experience a reduction in funding from the Goleta Friends of the Library by $11,700. We've got new information on parcel tax revenues that are going to increase by $7,800. But you can see that essentially the net of those last two items are going to come from reserves in the county library fund. This is not part of the general fund; it's a separate fund. But since that time, since we presented this to the Finance Committee, we've made some adjustments which are reflected here. And the top section essentially is, again, the reduced funding from the Carpinteria Friends of the Library, but instead of reducing book acquisition monies and hourly salaries, what we're doing is we're going to shift 20% of a senior library technician to the general fund, because essentially with this reduced funding, the library will be closed, will be only open 26 hours versus 40 hours. So we're gonna have to move this person somewhere else because they need to. Of course, they're still going to be fully employed. So we're shifting 20% of that person's time, and then because of the differential between the lost revenues and the savings from that shift, we're going to be able to increase the book acquisition budget by $1,400. The latter two items are really the same. Down below, you can see that we are reflecting the shift of that senior library technician to the general fund, and we're going to reduce our salaries to offset so that the net impact of the general fund is still zero, but we're just basically using permanent staffing rather than hourly staffing in the central library.
Mr. Hotchkiss has a question.
Quick question. Does that affect library services?
Yeah, the lost funding, Madam Mayor, Councilmember Hotchkiss, the lost funding in the county library for Carpinteria, that branch, we're going to reduce the number of hours of service, so that is a reduction in service in that library.
In Carpinteria?
In Carpinteria.
Thank you.
The next item shows the impact to the redevelopment agency from shifting the $217,000 or adding the funding for the restorative policing, and it's coming out of their project contingency account. So there's a net impact of zero, but of course it does reduce the amount they had available from their contingency account. And then the streets fund, you see the other piece of that where we're shifting the city engineer from the general fund to the streets fund. That's Pat Kelly, and they are. You can see that they are going to be increasing the cost, and they're reducing. I'm not sure what they're reducing there, but I think appropriated reserves to balance. So those were the staff recommended adjustments, and then additional adjustments coming out of their review. You could see the topics that were reviewed by the Finance Committee. We looked at the general fund, the revenue assumptions, and our balancing strategy. Also looked at the proposed capital program, not just for next year, but also for the 6-year plan. They reviewed the proposed fees and rate changes, not only in the general fund, but also in enterprise funds. And then we had a discussion of citywide reserves, balances, and our policies. And essentially, the recommendations that based on that review was the following: with regard to fees and charges, they voted 2-to-1 to support basically all fees that are proposed, except for there was no recommendation on the solid waste fees. As you know, as Mr. Armstrong indicated, we're still talking about that, and we're going to come back to you next Monday for further discussion. And then the other item was we had 2 Finance Committee members present. We talked about citywide reserve balances and policies, and they recommended to the Council that we bring this item to the Council for further discussion and further direction back to the Finance Committee, just to look at the policy and see if there's any way to improve that, particularly in the area of just, we have a policy that provides for the establishment of the reserves, but not necessarily addressing when they can be used and how they're going to be replenished over time. So we plan to come back to the full Council in early July with that item. So additional adjustments based on what we heard. 3 areas: adjustments to community promotions, restoring rental housing mediation funding for either 6 or 12 months, and then shifting the funding for the Chase Palm Park playground improvements from the general fund to the redevelopment agency. So some minor adjustments to community promotions: reduce the downtown visitor restroom program. We've not had a lot of participants, so we've had about 20,000 budgeted historically. We really only need about 9,000 or so, so we're reducing that appropriation by 10,850. And as you know, as just kind of a correction, we're no longer funding the 4th of July Symphony, so we're reducing the budget by 12,091. But we are going to increase the Spirit of 76 parade budget, which we thought about deleting, but we are now bringing that back for a cost of $5,000. But we do have a net savings to the general fund of almost $18,000 as a result of these adjustments. And all this savings will go to the appropriated reserves. That's at least our recommendation. So this is the Rental Housing Mediation Task Force. Before I get into what Council had asked us to come back with, I wanted just to show you that what the current budget includes, the proposed budget includes, and why, if we do nothing else, we're still going to need to make some changes because of the new information that we've got. So on the left, what's included in the original recommended budget is the salaries for a full-time rental housing mediation specialist of $108,000, and then some supplies and services. That's just ongoing. And then the funding we had initially included was $33,000 from a combination of the County of Santa Barbara and Carpinteria, 25 from the county and 8,000 from CARP. And then the city's CDBG funding of almost $61,000, and then human services funding of 22. And that $4,400 shortfall was being made up by the general fund and the increased subsidy. So that's what was in the budget. But if we do nothing else, we recognize now that a couple things, or a few things. One, the cost for the salaries should be lower because of the 5% furlough savings that we're going to recognize. So the real cost of that position will be $103,000. Down below, we are recognizing the fact that CARP is probably not going to be funding their $8,000 contribution anymore. And then because of the reduction in the CDBG letter of credit we heard about, we're only going to have $39,000 available to fund this program out of the CDBG. And then human service funding stays the same, so we now have a shortfall of $28,000. So again, if we do nothing else, we're going to have to come up with an additional $24,000 to fund the program. And this is based on just an information-only program where we have one full-time person providing information but no mediation services.
Mr. Francisco has a question.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Mr. Samario, could you explain what a rental housing mediation specialist does?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Francisco, actually I cannot. But Ms. Sue Gray is here, and I'm sure she can give you a lot more information than I could.
Ms. Gray.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Francisco, the rental housing mediation specialist, she is an active member of the program. She provides mediations for landlords and tenants. She organizes those are for the telephone mediations, the staff mediations. She also organizes the rental mediation task force members to do the formal mediations. She answers questions over the phone, and she oversees the entire program. So she supervises the part-time temporary employees.
Okay. Thank you. So
Oh, go ahead.
anyway, I'll save my comments for later.
Okay. Question, Ms. Self?
Yes, thank you, Madam Mayor. What does the part-time staff provide?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Self, they provide the direct services. So they all pretty much do the same thing. The full-time specialist, she's the person who's been there for over 20 years. She has a lot of experience. She can pretty much just answer questions off the top of her head. The part-time people are trained to answer telephone calls, give out information, and they do some of the mediations with a lot of oversight by the rental mediation specialist, the full-time person.
Thank you.
Mr. Rouse also has a question.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. It's great. What are the number of volunteer participants in that task force currently that are supervised by the staff?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Rouse, the committee can have up to 15. I'm not quite sure where they are right now. I would think
I hear the
10.
number 10.
They have 10 currently. 15 is their max.
Any other questions for now? Okay, thank you.
So this slide shows what this program would look like based on council's request to see if we just do city only but full services, so information and mediation services, what it would cost for either 6 months or 12 months. And essentially the numbers are just doubled for the 12-month figure, but you can see includes the full-time rental housing mediation specialist, one part-time rental housing mediation aide, so 20 hours a week, and then the supplies and services, and then the adjusted funding from CDBG and Human Services. And based on a 6-month program, full service, city only, it would cost $36,000 in the general fund, additional funding to make that happen. And then if we did 12 months, it would be double that.
A question on that. I understand the reduced CDBG funding because that's from HUD and we have no control over that. But is the rationale for the 6 months of the Human Services just because we're only looking at it for 6 months, or is that a policy decision from us if we wanted to utilize the full $22,000 and then thus reduce the other amount of additional funding from the general fund for 6 months?
Madam Mayor, Madam Mayor, I think that's a valid question. I think it is a policy decision. I think we wanted to use $22,000 for the 6 months. I believe we can. I'm not 100% sure, but I believe we can.
And if we kept the $11,000 from Human Services, that obviously gives additional $11,000 to Human Services, and what would be the recommendation for those funds that would then be unused? Ms. Gray?
Madam Mayor, we put $11,000 in the 6-month profile, assuming that after 6 months this program will still be in existence and need the extra $11,000.
Okay.
So if that doesn't happen, and you're right, you can use the full 22 for the first 6 months if that's what you choose to do, because it's for a year. The Human Services grant was for a year. If you decide to do that, then the 36 would be decreased. There wouldn't be an $11,000 left for the second half of the year if there was a program after that time. If you used $11,000 in 6 months and then there was a program after 6 months, you could reallocate that money, or it would just go back to the general fund at the end of the year.
Okay.
Usually when human service funds are not used, they usually just go back to the general fund.
Okay, thank you. Mr. House.
Ms. Gray, the services that we provide for the city have always been full service. Am I correct in understanding that up to now?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember House, yes.
And then for the county of Santa Barbara, unincorporated areas, what kind of services have we been providing?
For many years, we provided full services, and approximately 3 years ago, they did not have enough money to fund full services,
Right.
So we went to information only for
So
them.
they had made a switch with their funding that had them get the information-only kind of services.
Correct.
And that's what the $25,000 that had been in the the original and the revised budget from the county was paying for.
Yes.
Then I would just ask, why wouldn't we want to continue that, since they're reimbursing us for it, and it would be the same staff people anyway? Is there some rationale for not including that as a possibility here?
Not including it in this budget?
Yeah, I'm just saying, in a sense, it provides them with services, but it also pays a big portion of the pay for the people that are delivering the services here in the city of Santa Barbara as well. In other words, it helps to augment their
Correct.
costs and still provides the services to the county. Would there be a downside to our accepting that and providing
No,
that?
we would still accept it. What council asked for was
City only, I understand.
city only, and so if we do receive the $25,000 from the county for information only, we would still do that for this period. We would have another part-time person to do that for the extra workload.
And
So-
the workload would be, I mean, okay, it just seems to me that there might be a chance that the person would also be able to augment and help. It would be one of those synergy kind of things, so something to think about.
Yes, we would use the 25 to hire another part-time aide or a part-time rental mediation specialist. They all work together on the
Right.
different areas of the community, but basically the county would be subsidizing one
I
position.
see. Maybe that would be a way to consider that as we discuss this. Thank you.
Mr. Rouse?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. This may be difficult to answer. Does the money allocated to the county or the funds that are proportioned to the county represent full cost recovery?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Rouse, yes, it does. They pay for information only. They pay for their share.
And Ms. Self?
Thank you. Is it possible that some of the committee members could fill some of the positions of these part-time staff that we're having trouble budgeting for?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Self, that would be probably on an individual basis that would have to be looked at. A lot of the people on the committee work full-time, so they don't have the availability to come into the office. There are some who have been long-term members who it would basically be up to them if
But that
they
is a
wanted to.
possibility.
It would be, there's a lot of training involved in the day-to-day operations of the program. And I know in the past, volunteers have not been optimal for the program because it takes a lot of the rental mediation specialist's time to train people. So if she gets someone, she wants to keep them for a long period of time.
Yes, I've been doing some outreach in the community, and if you could send me the duties, the tasks, the time that would be needed. I have some people who have time available and would be willing to step in and commit to time to help to that end till we can see our way to more money later.
Okay, we'll send you that information.
Thank you.
That's all the questions for now. Yeah, go ahead, Mr. Samario.
Thank you. Another adjustment is, as we talked about, having the redevelopment agency fund the Chase Palm Park Playground Equipment Project. And what this does then, it frees up $200,000 in savings, which we're going to be recommending that we just put into appropriated reserves. It is one-time money, but still money we have available for next year. And that's really it. And I'm going to turn it over, unless there are any questions, to Mr. Armstrong. He'll talk about the next item.
Any other questions at this point? No, go ahead.
Yes, Madam Mayor and members of the council, I was going to briefly go over where we are on the enhanced funding for police. And first I wanted to just briefly review what we're proposing to do through the redevelopment agency. We're proposing a 3-year program, and the cost would be about $350,000 a year. And as Mr. Samario mentioned, our initial budget had $135,000. Excuse me. And then we're recommending that it be enhanced with another $217,000. What this would provide is one full-time officer dedicated to restorative policing, so that would double the current staffing. 3 part-time outreach workers who would work directly for the restorative policing officers, with the concept there that a lot of the restorative policing officer work is driving people to appointments, picking them up, doing a lot of legwork, and a lot of that work could be done more efficiently by these outreach workers. And this is something that when they talk with the folks down in Santa Monica, that Santa Monica had something similar. The other 6 employees would be 6 part-time community service officers. These folks would be to create a presence on State Street along the beach and on the Milpas corridor, highly visible, be identified as community service officers. They certainly wouldn't be sworn police officers. They wouldn't have those capabilities, but they would be the eyes and ears of the police department, be able to report things much quicker, but more importantly, provide a presence of some type in the community. We also, as you know, when we did the police budget hearing, we talked about, was there a way to convert some sworn positions that are primarily doing administrative work and replace those with non-sworn positions and basically free up officers to basically be on the street and enhance patrol. And the two positions we looked at is the special events coordination process, where we have a police officer doing that work now under the supervision of an administrative sergeant. And also in the training function, we also have a sworn officer under the direction of a sergeant doing a lot of the scheduling of training, making sure people are in compliance with POST, which is the statewide agency that does training. And we believe that we could move these to civilian positions. They cost about half of what a sworn officer does when you look at the benefits. The cost of that would be $143,000, but in effect you get 2 sworn officers in the street. And we would propose that you fund that from appropriated reserves. As you know, we originally budgeted $350,000 in appropriated reserves. There's been some movement back and forth, but that's how we would propose that that be funded. So what that does is provide about $500,000 of additional funding in that area, get you the equivalent, although they're not new sworn officers, 3 full-time officers on the street, the 6 part-time community service officers, and the 3 part-time outreach workers. Should the council want to look at additional police officers, I just kind of wanted to go through our thought process about where you would have to go. And there's no easy answers here. If you look at the other departments, the primary places you would have to look are community development, parks and recreation, library. I put fire on there just to kind of stimulate some discussion. If you're really serious, you'd need to look at closing a station. Obviously, you're not going to do that today, but in the long term, if you really want to shift priorities, I think you'd at least have to consider that. In appropriated reserves, with all of the changes that we've talked about, the appropriated reserves goes up to $430,000. And does that include already taken out and that includes taking out the funding for the sworn, for the 2 non-sworn. But you have $267,000 ongoing. That's the 350 minus the 143, and then you have $163,000 of one-time monies, and that's because of making that shift with the paying for the Chase Palm Park playground improvements with RDA funds. But that's basically one time. In the future, that money would not be there. Other sources of funding, you could look at the outside organizations that we fund. Convention and Visitor Bureau is receiving $1.3 million. Public access TV, as you know, we reduced them last year. There's no reduction this year, but you could look there. In events and festivals, you've got 132 and 290, but that's parts events and part festivals, so you've got that funding there. In human services, the total general fund contribution there is $778,000. You have already made allocations for fiscal year 12. So it wouldn't be fair to go back at that. But in terms of a long-term discussion, this would be an area you could tap. You could use general fund reserves. You could increase selected fees and charges, and I would caution you there that in some parts of our organization, for example, in building permit fees, we are already at full cost recovery, so you wouldn't be able to increase those. There might be a place, for example, planning fees. You could increase planning fees an additional 10%, which would basically then reduce the general fund subsidy to the community development department, which would free those funds up. I think you're limited there. In Parks and Recreation, I would not recommend that you increase fees, because our experience in the past when we've done that to try and balance the general fund budget is we've created issues where the participation dropped and we didn't gain any total revenue. So I think Parks and Recreation tries to look at the market there and what the market will bear, and so I don't think there's much opportunity there. You might increase, the fees for downtown dining. That's another option that you could look at. But there's not a lot of, I don't think there's a lot of upside in your fees and charges. And then in the long term, you could look at a tax measure. It would require voter approval. You're going to receive a report from the police station remodel committee at the end of June, which is going to talk about that potential. You might combine something with the a new police building and include something for police funding there. And again, I'm thinking out a year or two, but there's opportunities for you there as well.
Madam Mayor, just to clarify, the events and festivals, the 132 is what we pay to the county for staff support, and then the 295 is actually for program grants to those efforts.
I do want to remind you of the challenges that are out there, and this is where I'm really concerned, and that is, first, please remember that the budget that you have proposed to you right now is still balanced with one-time measures that we still have to deal with in the future. That includes almost $1.9 million in concessions, and those are just concessions yet to be achieved. We've also got concessions already in place with the Police and Fire Association. It includes a rebate from the self-insurance fund of $567,000, $150,000 from the underground and utility fund, and $131,000 from the underground tank program. What that means is we still have a structural imbalance of about $2.7 million that we're going to have to deal with next year. Now, if the economy improves, some of that would just go away because sales tax would meet our expectations, or property tax. But who knows what the economy is going to do. If you read the newspapers the last couple of days and the Wall Street Journal this morning, they're starting to be concerned about whether or not the economy is going to improve that well. But it's something. What I'm concerned about is if you add to the budget at this point and create an ongoing obligation, it makes a deeper hole next year, and you need to think very seriously about that. Just to remind you, public safety now is about 54% of the general fund. Go back to that one. And as I think we sent you a schedule earlier this week, and that's gone up from, I think, 48% over the last 10 years. So 44. So it continues to grow at a more rapid rate, and that's primarily a result of salaries, benefits, especially PERS cost. And so then you can see the other departments. But what's even a little more interesting is if you look at how we fund public safety. Go to the next slide. Public safety right now uses about 71% of the tax revenues we receive because it doesn't receive a lot of fees and charges like a lot of the other departments do. So, for example, in community development, close to half of the entire department is funded with fees and charges. In the administrative departments, such as finance, city administrator's office, we charge overhead out to the enterprise operations, and over 50% of those operations are funded through overhead. So it makes our challenge more difficult if we want to enhance public safety, because if you cut in the other areas, you may only get 50 cents on the dollar. Library would probably be the only exception because library doesn't have a lot of fees and charges other than library fines. But it just makes that challenge more difficult. Some of the other challenges I just wanted to go over. The public safety retirement cost will likely outpace revenue growth for the next 3 years at least. In our mind, it's going to take about 3 to 5 years of strong revenue growth to grow our way out of the problem just in the status quo budget. And we do have long-term contracts with both the police and fire unions. We're basically going into the second year of those contracts that provides 3% in concessions this upcoming year. I think it's 3 with fire and 4 with police. But the following year it's a 0, and then it has an increase. So we don't have a lot of flexibility there with about over half of our labor groups. That's pretty well fixed, and it's going to make it more difficult to deal with it. So our recommendation is to maintain the status quo, add those additional officers as I've talked about, continue the aggressive hiring of sworn officers. I think we're doing as well as I've seen us do over the last several years in terms of getting people into the academies and getting ahead of the game. Rapidly implement what we have recommended. I've personally gone down into HR and I've told them do whatever it takes to fill those outreach positions, fill those community service officer positions and the civilian positions. Do it as quickly as possible, whatever it takes. And then monitor the results carefully and assess how we're doing. But that's our recommendation, and based upon all of the challenges that I've talked about. And then this is a recap of all of our recommendations, and you may want to review those after you receive public comment.
Thank you. Questions from council before we move to public comment? Mr. White.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. An option, the staff's recommendation is that the civilianization occur and that 2 more safety folks be put on boots on the ground. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Can you give us refresh our memories on where we are in the ramp up of going to the functional strength of making use of the bodies that we have already? As I understand it, over the last couple of years, we've been down, and now we're actually playing catch up. But I would appreciate hearing.
Deputy Chief Mannix.
Yeah, hearing.
You know, Deputy
where we
Chief
are.
Mannix is our expert in this area.
Good morning, Madam Mayor and members of council. Presently, we are at full staffing with our police officer strength, but 5 of those full staffing positions are currently in the police academy. We anticipate sending 9 additional officers, which would be continuing in our overhiring practices in order to keep our staffing at or near full strength. And that full strength is 137.
Okay, so we have 5 more bodies that will be in the rotation here when they finish the academy and obviously get trained?
Yes, we have 5 graduating next month who are currently in the academy, and we are going to send an additional 9. Now, we do...
And you have retirements that are coming and...
Yes, in the next few months we anticipate 5 vacancies, and then so we will have already hired for those 5, and then because you get additional unplanned vacancies throughout the course of the year, we're going to pick up 4 more.
Okay, and thank you. And then one more staff recommendation has 1 more safety personnel coming out of the RDA funds, and I'm thinking that the civilianization could occur and actually end up with just a cost savings too. If we didn't put more boots on the ground, we could just save $100,000 or something.
Yeah, you could do that, but basically then you would have less sworn officers if you did that. You'd basically eliminate 2 sworn officer positions and fill those with civilian positions. So,
okay.
But you could do that. And basically the net effect on the ground would be basically what you have now.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mannix.
Other questions? I have a question, Deputy Chief Mannix. During your presentation, talking about functional strength and authorized strength and looking at sworn positions and reallocating some to meet patrol needs, such as PAL and DARE and so forth. If we had 137, if the authorized strength is the same as the functional strength, which is what, with the 5 coming in next month and the 9 soon after, we should have and have for a while, would that allow the department to have an officer back for DARE, for example, or, for some of the other positions beyond patrol that has been shifted around? Do you see where I'm getting with that? Yes.
If we have budgeted for a DARE and a PAL officer in the proposed budget, with the anticipation that as our strength recovers and we reach that 137 functional strength level, we could fill those positions. However, I have to point out that virtually always we have a list of officers who are not capable of being in the field at any given time. Sure. The most obvious, of course, are the ones who are currently in training. So we have 5 in training that take away from that 137 strength, and
Right.
then we have presently about 7 more who are out. So we have 12 officers who are hired by the department and are on the city payroll, but they're unable to work in the field right now.
Okay, and then the 2 sworn officers who are currently doing the administrative duties, if we were to hire the civilian positions for those, moving those sworn officers into the field, I guess, that would help somewhat without changing the number of authorized positions in terms of filling those extra slots like DARE and PAL, or I mean, I'm assuming that's, am I correct in that assumption? Because their time is now doing other activities other than the administrative work.
Yes, they would be added to enforcement duties. Our primary mission is our call for service workload. We need to keep enough officers on team strength so we can respond to calls for service in a reasonable time fashion, both to service the public and then the internal servicing of police officers when they need assistance in the field. You need to have a certain level of ability to respond. So we know that we need to keep that around 50. As we fall below 50 and towards 45, we draw down from specialty units. And then as we get over 50, we think about filling those specialty units. Right now, we're about 47, 46. I'd need to double check. But so those 2 additional officers would most likely go to team strength first until we get to that 50 level, and then we'll look at filling those specialties.
Okay. Okay, I think that helps. Ms. Self?
Thank you. Could PAL or DARE be filled with either our reserve officers or non-sworn?
No, that would be outside the scope. Reserve officers, their mission has been redefined by the state of California as a level 3 reserve. That's the amount of training that our reserve officers typically have, and as such, they have very limited duties. And those 2 assignments would be outside the scope of their training.
How about non-sworn?
We have non-sworn working in PAL right now. PAL is a recognized 501c3, and they have a non-sworn strength that they employ to carry out the PAL mission. The executive director right now is a retired police captain, so we have that police presence, and that executive director works for the 501c3.
Okay, and then at one point we had 150 officer strength, didn't we? About 10 years ago?
About 10 years ago, we had 150 working. I believe our grand total actually is 152 in a proposed budget back in 2002, but we never were able to fill 152 positions.
How many did we have?
About 150.
So we've adjusted down what we consider full strength from what it was about 10 years ago.
Yes, we've had to redefine our services and our ability to do our job, but we've always maintained our call for service workload as a priority. Second priority is our investigative resources. And then some of these other positions, such as DARE and PAL, quite frankly, we probably should have pulled them sooner. But those are difficult positions to be in halfway. You're either all the way in DARE or all the way out of DARE because you're teaching the program for a year at the schools. And sometimes during that year, you will find yourself stressed with staffing. And but we decided not to pull the officer out because we were committed. As it turns out, this time our DARE officer retired at a time when we were short-staffed, so we've elected to leave that position vacant, and we've done that in the past as well.
I hope you don't take what I say as a criticism. We're trying to get more of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. House?
So just taking from what you'd said, I think to the mayor's questions, there is a definite benefit of putting non-sworn officers into the administrative function and releasing 2 sworn officers into wherever you would want to deploy them in the field.
There's a benefit and there's a liability as well. Okay. We like the current paradigm the way it is. Let me be clear about that. There is value in having a special events coordinator with law enforcement experience who has actually worked special events in the field. So that's a benefit. However, there's also a benefit in putting 2 more police officers in the field, and it's a matter of adjusting priorities or recognizing priorities. Personally, I feel it's a stronger priority to have more officers in the field for those reasons I had previously mentioned than the loss of the expertise in those 2 positions.
Thank you. I appreciate the answer. And one thing that we haven't discussed, although you brought this up really early in our conversations, and that is the situation that we have in dispatch. That's gotten, at least seemed from what your remarks, got to kind of a critically low level. Where are we with regards to that? And we haven't been talking about that here. Where do we stand with regards to that?
We're currently proposing an authorized strength of 18 dispatchers, which is what we have presently. We're currently staffed with 12 dispatchers. However, one dispatcher has tendered her resignation because she has passed the bar exam and she plans to pursue a career in law. So this will take one dispatcher away. In addition, we have 2 police officers who are on maternity light duty who are working in dispatch presently, and that's an effective use of that skill level. However, they are both approaching full term, and we're anticipating losing those 2 positions as well. As a result, we will have to backfill those with able-bodied police officers that will have to draw from team strength in order to do that. Or we may pull a vacancy or a specialty position into team strength and then move the team strength into patrol or a dispatch.
So there's 18 proposed in the budget?
Yes.
And if I do the math, we could be as low as 9 without these adjustments that you're going to need to make. Or
without those adjustments,
right.
That's correct.
So then with this budget, you would have the fiscal ability to fill those positions, but then you have to do the recruitment and the training and all the rest.
Right, and we're currently heavily recruiting. We have 5 dispatchers in background that we're looking to hire, and as a matter of fact, they look pretty good. Our major problem in our dispatching staffing level is not the hiring, it's in the retention, because so many of the new hires fail to successfully complete training. So we've added a training coordinator who is a retired dispatch supervisor specifically to work on higher levels of retention. We're buying a simulated dispatch computer center so the dispatchers can get training away from the stressful on-the-job training that tends to burn them out during their training cycles. So it's recognizing that what we really need to do is get our people through training better than we have been doing. So we've hired this training coordinator, and we're very optimistic we're going to get a positive result out of it.
Okay, very good. I really appreciate these answers. So just bottom line on this one, with what's in the budget, you would have the authorization, the financial wherewithal to accomplish 18, but then it's a matter of the actual, how do you accomplish it, and then how do you retain them once you get them on board?
That's correct.
Thank you very much.
Can I clarify something you said on dispatch? You said you had a couple of sworn officers about to go on leave, and you're going to need to fill those slots, but you said that you may have to use other sworn positions to do that. Why not just use non-sworn if you're hiring? Because are those sworn positions, when they come back from leave, go back to dispatch, or are they going to go back being a sworn officer out in the field?
They could do either.
So why wouldn't we bring them back onto the field and then have the dispatch positions be filled with non-sworn staff?
The dispatching center is traditionally filled with non-sworn staff,
right.
the dispatcher. As the numbers fall below what is minimum staffing levels down there, we need to backfill it with someone
right.
who has that expertise. Some of our police officers have been trained in dispatch because they've been injured, and during their convalescence, we've moved them down there perhaps as long as a year. And with their training in police background already, they pick up on the discipline very quickly. As a result, we have this supply of dispatch-trained police officers. As our staffing and our non-sworn dispatcher strength falls below minimum, we draw from those police officers who have that training, and we put them in there. We currently have about a strength of 18 with the police officers. We have the 12 that are currently hired. We have 2 or 3 police officers who are in there, and then we have several overtime shifts that our dispatchers are regularly working that gives us kind of a functional strength of 18. As the police officers return to duty, we will plug them in where the doctor allows us,
sure.
basically. They'll give us medical limitations, and they'll either be full duty, ready to go in the field, or if they're on light duty, we'll put them somewhere, and that could be dispatch.
That part I understand. I think what I thought I heard you say was that while they're on leave, you may need to use other officer strength in dispatch, when in fact you're also recruiting for non-sworn dispatchers. So why not fill those vacancies with the non-sworn and keep it that way? And if the officers, when they come back from leave, still need to be on light duty, there's an opportunity for them to go to dispatch, but you don't have to do that with other sworn officers.
Yes, I think I understand your question. The non-sworn who are hired and who are in the process of being hired right now have about an 11-month training curve before they're functional in dispatch.
That's why. So it's that gap. But after the 11-month, then that situation should subside.
Right.
Okay. That was the piece of information I was missing. Thank you.
Sorry.
Mr. Rouse.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Deputy Chief Mannix, I'll probably confuse the team versus authorized versus functional strength terms, so forgive me. As I understand it, 137 is our authorized strength currently, and we have 12 that are not able to be in the field as a snapshot of today.
That's correct.
So 125. And you were saying that your ideal, I guess, shift strength, to make a new term, is 50 on a particular shift to make, if you had to, in an ideal situation.
At full staffing, it would be 57.
57, okay, so, and would I be correct in assuming that a shift is an 8-hour shift, the 3 8-hour shifts in a day?
Well, it's either a 10-hour shift or a 12-and-a-half-hour shift.
Okay. And so there's some overtime built into...
The overtime is not compensated as overtime by the MOU.
Right. Okay. But as I try to think about scheduling and trying to do the math, it just seems like we're stretching the numbers of officers we have, which I think is kind of obvious. And I wondered about two things about it. Of course, there's level of service concerns. There's also police officer safety concerns. As you mentioned before, part of your duty is to respond to other officers in the field for assistance. And I think, and if I can be correct in remembering this, Chief, you mentioned that there is a concern because you have one officer in a squad car as opposed to two, which would be a normal scenario in a lot of other cities. Is that correct?
Well, in the larger cities, they have 2 officers per vehicle. We do not have that unless one's being trained. And even over the last few days, you've seen where one officer responding to something that turned into something a lot worse than it was required a lot of response by the other officers to literally, and I mean this, literally save that officer. So it's an issue. And I think when you talk about response times to a call for service is one thing. A couple of days ago, that response was to another officer who was in dire straits. So it's critical that we have those bodies out there.
And my last question would be, it's a little bit different than the subject we've talked about, but the use of new retirees that could be on part-time duty or supplemental duty, certainly their ancillary costs are already covered in their retirement. Is there any consideration of that, or do we already utilize those personnel, and are they available to us?
So Mayor Snyder, Councilmember Rouse, we already utilize retirees to assist us with backgrounds on the dispatchers and the sworn, and they are extremely busy, especially when we started going to the overhiring directive. We had to bring some retirees back who had background investigating experience to do that. We're utilizing them in a huge way. Remember that what they do part-time, especially law enforcement-wise, impacts their retirement. So they can only work so many hours a year to do that. So it sort of limits us. One of the ways that we've been thinking of bringing some of them back, and we haven't really set this in stone yet, is with some of our cold case homicides that are sitting there that we can't get to because our detectives are extremely busy with fresh cases, if you will. So that's one area where other departments, I just visited Ventura Sheriff's Department, where they have 7 retirees working just those amount of hours that they can to help them with some of those cold cases. That's where we're thinking of utilizing them in the future. But to put them in the field on patrol on a part-time basis would be not a good idea. For several reasons, but the biggest one is that we're limited to the time that they can work, and that probably wouldn't be a good allocation of that resource.
Thank you.
Okay, I think that concludes questions. We have some more. I'm going to move to public comment. Great. Okay, I have Robert Burke. You want to yield your time to Justin Cullum, but is Justin Cullum here? I'm sorry? Oh, there you are. Okay. So I don't see. Justin, do you have a speaker slip?
Yeah.
Oh, there you are. I found you. Okay. Hold on. Well, I have Justin Dellum listed twice, so that doesn't count. But so I have your name twice, but that only counts for once, and then Mr. Burke. So unless someone else is putting in a slip you have 4 minutes. Is there someone else who's yielding their time? What's your name? And did you submit a speaker slip? I don't see if you could fill out a speaker slip and hand that in just so for the records, that would be great. So we can give Mr. Dellum 6 minutes. Great. Thank you.
Okay.
Good morning.
Madam Mayor, members of the City Council, good morning. My name is Justin Dellum, and I'm the Vice Chairman of the Rental Housing Mediation Task Force. I volunteer for this position, and I've spent many hours training and mediating on behalf of the city. And I strongly disagree with elements with the current recommendation to cut the staff and services of the Rental Housing Mediation Task Force. For over 3.5 decades, the task force has helped thousands of renters, landlords, neighbors, roommates peacefully and inexpensively settle disputes simply by providing a neutral environment for people to discuss their issues. No courts, no judgments, no legal fees, just mediated conversations that otherwise wouldn't happen. And we have a 97% success rate over this 3.5 decades. And that means people have resolved their disputes, people leave our meetings, they go return to their homes, and there's no evictions. The problem's been solved. Renters in Santa Barbara, your constituents are a majority. It's 60%. This is to say that renting property in Santa Barbara is a big deal. It's big business. It is a thriving market that houses people of all income levels with roofs provided by both large property firms and the neighbor down the street who just rents a spare room to make his ends meet. Successful mediations benefit all of these parties equally. For instance, a tenant avoids being evicted. That's obvious. And a landlord's property remains occupied and her flow of income and profitability remain undisturbed. And there's a ripple effect beyond that. Each problem solved could develop into a worst case that can end in homelessness or violence. And without our program, it's going to seek resolution in other ways, in less efficient ways, like the police, the courts, lawyers, perhaps all three. They can get very, very expensive. Take each mediation and you can understand how much our work has benefited over these 3.5 decades, how much money and time and effort it's saved other departments. And all this while, the city has never contributed significantly through its general fund, beyond lending the weight of its seal, which is very important in lending us the credibility we need to function properly. Of course, it gives us an office to do our business. But unlike Goleta and Carpinteria, we've never received money directly from the general fund. And I think the city's gotten a tremendous bargain. So we return to this recommendation, and of course our funding is shrinking. And the response from the city is to end the Rental Housing Mediation Task Force, essentially by eliminating the mediation task force part of it. The recommendation eliminates the task of mediation from staff, and it means to abolish the 15-member board of which I'm a member, a volunteer board. That's volunteer. I've yet to learn how the city will save money by abolishing a board of trained staff that works for free. But I do know that that is the force part of the task force. It's a trust that's been built, a private and public partnership that's been built over 3.5 decades, is well known throughout the community, again, as a 97% success rate. What a shame it would be to dismantle that outlet for these problems. You've seen the numbers of the shortfall this morning and the various scenarios to keep this going. I think the good news is it's not that great of a figure. However, if it's $70,000, $80,000 to keep one full-time person and 2 part-time people, and at the very least the free volunteer board in place, that amount of money is the entire program. To cut that out and cut out the services, it's not just a reduction in staff, it's an elimination of this very important program. And I'll underline it once more, that when you get rid of the mediation task force part, what remains is the rental housing part of the RHMTF. And so you can cut the program, but you're not going to cut any of the problems that are created by the thousands of relationships of landlord-tenants that exist in this community. So someone's going to be left holding that bag. And the amount of money that you invest just comes back many-fold. So our program will continue to seek new grants and funding sources. But we should be able to rely on the general fund for the shortfall. There are just no other outlets for these problems. Our city needs this service. It deserves the service. And I call on you to vigorously support the Rental Housing Mediation Task Force. And I've got just a few seconds left, and I wanted to address Ms. Self's comments about volunteering for the part-time staff. Our board has discussed that possibility, and we find that they're just too well trained. They're not just disseminating information about landlord-tenant rights. These are highly emotional issues. They're often, I think of them more akin to social workers who are really well trained. It's not the kind of position you can just walk in and answer the phone and hope to do well. You're probably going to be fielding a call from someone that's quite frantic because they're about to lose their home. It's not something to be taken lightly. It's a very, very serious program. We do very serious work that's very difficult. So I just wanted to throw that in there. And I'm out of time, and I
Thank you. Mr. Hotchkiss has a question for you.
I do. Thank you. Hi, Mr. Dellum. How are you?
I'm well.
Knowing we have a shortfall in money, as you may sometimes have in your own budget, as we all do, how would you cut to make this work?
Well, now, I'm just a volunteer for the board. I've never had to deal with the mechanisms of funding the board until now, and I'll admit that it's been a learning process for me to see how some of this shakes out. I don't have a direct answer. I've responded to various members of the council we met with, more as a means to underline the point that there's other expenditures in the budget that I feel don't rise to the priority level of this. I used the example of power turf equipment for the golf course. Not that I wanted to pick on golfers or Parks and Recreation, but here we're looking at a $70,000 annual expenditure for not just a park that everyone enjoys, but a golf course that people pay to play on, people pay for the privilege to use, yet their recreation is funded well. And nor are they asked to volunteer on the weekends to mow the golf course, as we're asked to volunteer.
Let's just cut this short, because you could go on forever, and all the golfers already hate you, so let's skip that part. But I mean, within the program itself, we want these to be self-sustaining, sustainable in the modern terminology. Do you have any quick recommendations that could help this problem? If you don't, that's okay, but just tell me.
No, I really don't. But
Okay.
I can tell you that this shortfall is something our board is working on to fill in the long term. We're looking at ways that we can step up our effort to look for grant money,
Right.
find other ways to volunteer, but it's not going to happen tomorrow.
Okay, and if we went to a 6-month program, that would be sort of a period that would allow you to hustle and get your own funds, or try to find additional or even agree to pay some for mediation amongst the stakeholders, if possible. You could work on that in that 6 months.
Well, it wouldn't hurt.
Okay.
A year would be much more useful and productive for us.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. House also has a question for
Real
you.
quick question
Mr.
for you. Are you a professional mediator? Do you do mediation? as a
No,
profession?
no, I'm not. I do them just for the rental housing.
You got your training from?
Through the task force.
So that's what the staff members were doing? Were training you and getting you prepared to do the work?
They did some of the training. I did some of the training as a witness to mediations. And our board meets once a month, and often professional mediators come in. We do role play scenarios.
I see. So the training's ongoing, and
The
so
training is ongoing.
So the longer somebody's with the program, probably the more proficient they actually get.
Exactly.
I would imagine.
I'm vice chairman of the board, but that's just kind of a, we shuffle through that and provide a function. I'm not one of the more seasoned mediators. You call me a junior mediator, call me what you'd like. The people on the board, there's attorneys, there's people that are professional mediators. It's a tremendous resource of expertise.
Amazing. I'm not going to ask you this question, but I'm wondering what the value, like in terms of what mediators cost these days, if you had to actually hire one straight out, and what the value of all this volunteer effort really might be. And again, I'm not asking you that question, but it really raises that to my consciousness that the volunteer time has some value. It's not just free. It's actually people taking time out of their days and learning all this stuff and participating at this level.
That was a statement more than a question. So thank you. Thank you. And thank you for your service.
Thank you very much.
Maureen Earls will be next. And then Leslie Wiscombe, you've asked for 5 minutes. I usually ask if other people want to yield their time if you want more than 2 minutes. But you're chair of the Parks and Rec Commission. I can give you 3. And if you want to find someone, I can do that. I just want to be fair to everyone else in the room like I just did with Mr. Dullum. So, but Maureen Earls will be next. Good morning.
Good morning, Mayor, City Council members. I'm Maureen Earls speaking on behalf of CLUE, Clergy and Laity United for Economic Justice. I've sent a letter to you with our support for the proposed budget for the police department, with the additional staff including 3 officers, 3 outreach workers, and 3 community service people. We oppose the amendment to hire 10 additional officers for $1,500,000. I know several have emailed you in support of our position, and I've submitted a written list of other supporters, which I will give at the end of this. We believe it's highly possible that the majority in Santa Barbara would support our position. We believe it is the right thing to do. We support the current plan and the budget on the condition that you and the police department outline for the public measurable outcomes for this expenditure. I know Casa Esperanza has records of outcomes for outreach workers. For example, recording the number of street contacts, the ongoing contacts with the same client, the number of clients who access services. We really need to have an accountability if we're going to evaluate the effectiveness of this plan as we come before you next year. Data from our Common Ground survey shows that over 50% of those on the streets and without homes have some level of mental illness. Assuming that many of the inappropriate behaviors that have been talked about at our meetings here from those on the streets could be caused by those needing services for mental illness, then outreach staff and community service people who are trained could be the ones trained with the skill set to reach out to them. Data from our survey also shows those without homes are here because of jobs, relatives, or friends, not because of they're wrongfully labeled as enabling services that are provided. So it's with this network that we think the healing with these outreach workers can be achieved for our homeless people.
Thank you. Leslie Wiscombe will be followed by Tony Schultes. Good morning.
Good morning, Madam Mayor, members of the City Council. I'm scurrying around here trying to make my 5 minutes.
I appreciate your flexibility.
We did, as I am Leslie Wiscombe, the chairman of the Parks and Recreation Commission, and I believe all of you have a memo from the commission on our recommendations, but I just wanted to highlight a couple of them. With respect to the General Fund Capital Program, the Commission is concerned about the long list of unfunded, deferred capital projects. In some cases, the Commission believes that continued delays in funding projects involving replacement of equipment or performing much-needed repairs may result in closures of some facilities for safety reasons until projects are funded to move forward. The Commission believes Mesa Lane Steps is one such project. Therefore, if RDA funds are used to fund Chase Palm Park playground project, the Commission recommends that $200,000 in the general fund slated for this project be applied instead to Mesa Lane Steps. And the Commission would like to emphasize that having the additional $200,000 for this project will ensure a higher likelihood of grant funding. And with respect to some of our other recommendations, with respect to volunteers, the department has no formalized program at present, but rather runs a series of events. There are many more tasks that volunteers might be able and willing to perform in our parks under a more formalized program. Therefore, the Commission recommends that the Council approve the Administrative Division budget, including staff support, to develop a comprehensive park volunteer program. Also, the Commission strongly recommends that additional staffing to implement and support this program be a priority in future years, as there are no allocated funds for implementation of the program right now. Okay, and I'd also like to highlight integrated pest management. This is in relation to deferred maintenance in our parks, and I believe also the formalized park volunteer program also begins to address the deferred maintenance that's taken place in our parks. The Commission commends the Park Division for reducing use of pesticides since the implementation of the IPM program in 2004. And while community advocates of the program pledge volunteer support, little has been accomplished and staff equipment has been reduced. The reality is that the green practice has increased maintenance costs. Therefore, the Commission recommends that the Council direct staff to review the IPM program with aim to identify practices and policies that potentially reduce maintenance without substantial compromise to the IPM program itself. In closing, the Commission commends the Parks and Recreation Department staff for their hard work in these tough times, initiatives to advance programs and activities, and their can-do attitude to keep our parks safe and clean. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair Wiscombe. Tony Schultes will be followed by Silvio Di Loretto.
Madam Mayor, members of the Council, I'm Tony Schultes. I'm from the Santa Barbara League of Women Voters. The League of Women Voters of Santa Barbara came before you at the May 2nd meeting to speak in favor of preserving funding for the Rental Housing Mediation Task Force. The RHMTF exemplifies the ideal of a private and public partnership working with the city to provide what is an essential service. Mediation benefits both tenants and landlords in our city and surrounding areas by solving disputes and avoiding unnecessary and expensive litigation. The RHMTF supplies volunteer, professional mediators at no charge for this purpose. They have been providing mediation services between landlords and tenants for over 30 years. Tenants, landlords, and the community benefit from this essential and valuable service. To eliminate funding for the 2 part-time positions would effectively cut out the heart of this valuable and well-functioning program. The LWVSB asked you in May, and we urge you at the City Council again today, to keep this irreplaceable all-volunteer task force funded, keeping the full staff so that it can function effectively. Thank you.
Thank you. Silvio Di Loretto will be followed by Hazel Putney.
In a short time, I won't be able to walk up here. Well, Honorable Mayor and members of the City Council, I compliment each and every one of you for, coming here and facing your tough problems and your decisions that you make every day. To address Frank Hotchkiss's question was, how can we make more money as far as the service are concerned? I think that the leader of the task force, Andrea Befano, she does a phenomenal job in grant writing as part of her duties. And I think and also I just happen to think about but the senior volunteer program. Maybe we can go to them and get some assistance for some of this, if we can train some of them, if they can commit themselves. I suggested, Michael, I suggested many years ago that members of the volunteer staff volunteer to come in and sit in the office and handle calls, and we gave that up because it just wasn't possible to give the professional advice that is being given. But I'd like to just tell a little anecdote. This problem will not go away. I mean, the monies will be spent in the county. This committee was formed 35, 36 years ago as an alternative to litigation. And it's been successful. And we formed a wonderful partnership. Joan Brooks was here earlier. She had to leave because she had an eye appointment. But in Los Angeles, they cannot get the tenants and to form a partnership with the landlords. They cannot get that. But we got it here, and we've worked hard for that. And we've been very successful. Thank you very much. I'm strongly in favor of keeping the program.
Hazel Putney will be followed by Joe Black.
Hello, good morning. My name is Hazel Putney. I'm here representing an organization called Pueblo, and I'm also here as a member of the Rental Housing Roundtable. Pueblo's mission is to build a stronger voice for working families across Santa Barbara County, and one of the issues that heavily impacts working families across the county surrounds tenants' rights. I want to speak to, I've heard great recommendations around partnerships between the task force and local nonprofits and other stakeholders concerned with renters' rights. And a real example of that was in the end of 2008, the mass evictions on Modoc Road, where 204 tenants were facing eviction. So Pueblo at that time was able to partner with the Rental Housing Mediation Task Force in making these evictions more timely and more fair for these tenants. Pueblo did work around organizing, doing tenants' rights, collecting testimonies. But one thing we couldn't do, and we weren't able to do, was conduct the mediation. And that's where the Rental Housing Mediation Task Force came in. And so this was a beautiful task force, and this was a beautiful partnership. But the role of mediation was done by the Mediation Task Force, not Pueblo. And so we see this partnership, and we want to continue this partnership, and we know that we can do what we can to advocate for tenants' rights and fill this void, but one thing we can't afford to lose is mediation. And also, we really wanted to speak to the key aspect of neutrality in mediation. When looking at mediation, we need both parties to buy in, right? We need a neutral source to conduct the mediation. Organizations like Pueblo, we have a history of advocating on behalf of tenants, and we might not feel like the safest place for a landlord to go for mediation. And so we really see how key that is, and how the task force, being a city entity, has that neutrality. And so we're here also really asking that we keep the 2 part-time staff and keep mediation as part of the task force.
Joe Black will be followed by Reverend Doug Miller.
Morning, Mayor.
Morning.
Council. My name is Josephine Black, Joe Black, sorry, and I'm the Executive Director for Independent Living Resource Center. And I'm here on behalf of the Rental Mediation Task Force, and I want to throw some other issue into the mix here for your consideration. Eliminating this, reducing the services of the task force to phone only has a disproportionate impact on people with disabilities, with several specific disabilities. The phone only contact is very difficult for people who have brain injuries, seniors with strokes, people with other cognitive limitations. It's extremely difficult for people who are deaf and hard of hearing and who need to be in close proximity and see body language and use other cues that can't be garnered over the phone with somebody who has limited hearing. People with mental health issues who have an issue around not face-to-face, who also cue off a person that they're dealing with. And in particular, housing is a challenge for people with mental health issues, and maintaining housing when behavioral may go off the behavior may go off the rails temporarily, and mediation can help get things reinstated and maintain housing. That is a particular population of people that will be disproportionately impacted, and I just wanted to sort of put that on the table for consideration. This is since housing is critical for all people with disabilities and hard to come by. So thank you for your attention, and I don't envy your position.
Reverend Doug Miller will be followed by Hillary Klieger.
Madam Chairperson and council members. I represent the Santa Barbara Clergy Association and the Interfaith Initiative. We're very, very supportive of restorative policing. We're not in favor of adding more police. A few weeks ago, we saw a tremendous presentation, PowerPoint presentation, that the indices that are used to determine whether a community is safe or not showed that we've had an 8% decrease in crime. And these are universally acknowledged. Santa Barbara is safer. And we've done it with less. And one of the officers got up and made a beautiful presentation of the fact that in the last few years they've learned how to do policing better. Even though they were opposed to it in the beginning, they learned that it works. They're more efficient. Most of you are business persons, and a good business model is to do more with less. And it seems to me that we've got a very effective police department the way it is. Also, the fact of most municipalities today are decreasing employees because of PER and other reasons. If we added 10 or 12 police officers in the long run, that comes up to $50, $60 million for over a 30, 40-year period. That seems to me to be a very ineffective economic model in light of the cutbacks that are going on today. But we as the religious community are also interested in the moral issues. We're very concerned about the public discourse. Just this week, there was an article in the Daily Sound likening our friends and neighbors and brothers and sisters without homes to pigeons and to annoying mosquitoes. This is very degrading public discourse, and we're concerned. And if you read the online responses to that article, it even gets worse. There's tremendous underlying hatred in this community for outgroups. I haven't heard that kind of language for 60 years against minority groups.
Do you wind up, please?
Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Hillary Klieger will be followed by Emily Allen.
Vicki Allen has offered to yield to me. I have
Okay.
a habit of going over myself.
So you have 4 minutes.
Okay. Thank you. Madam Mayor and members of the City Council, I'm Hillary Klieger. I am the chair of the Rental Housing Roundtable. I'm also the advisor to the Isla Vista Tenants Union, which is the only tenant union in Santa Barbara County. Every day I hear from tenants who are frustrated and scared because their landlord is coming in without notifying them. They are ignoring their pleas for repairs. They're unlawfully taking money from security deposit for damages that don't actually exist. I've had people come in with basically landlords who are remodeling their house and trying to charge their their tenant for it. And this mediation is what's keeping our tenants and landlords out of court, and it's what's keeping our tenants in their homes. I recently had my own situation with my landlord where the repair people were coming in without notification. I was coming home and I couldn't get into my house because the steps were being painted, which is great, but it just would have been helpful that I had known. And there was just ongoing issues like that. And, communication got a little bit heated, and I was thinking that I was going to have to find a new place to live. And my landlord was thinking he wanted to get rid of me because he wasn't happy that I actually knew what my rights were and that I was asking for proper notification before a repair person would enter my home. So it can happen to anyone, and even with my skills working at the tenants union, I was finding myself in a precarious situation. The all-volunteer board is trained and dedicated, but to rely on volunteers for clerical staff would put the program at risk. I have 20 years of experience working with volunteers, and volunteers should be commended for their time and energy, but there's very little accountability. Because if they don't want to show up, they don't have to. In fact, the acting chair of Isla Vista Tenants Union was going to come today, but I got a text at 9 a.m. this morning telling me that he had to finish his senior project, which I get. He's graduating and it needs to happen, but he didn't show up, and what can I do? I can't make him be here. So I just want to speak to the fact that I think it's really important that the clerical staff be funded because that support is really needed. This volunteer mediation task force is dedicated. It's something that they really believe in, and it's they're dedicated to that part about mediation. But I think it would be extremely difficult to find volunteers who would find satisfaction in the clerical support work, and to retain them. And previous folks have talked about the training that is needed, and it is really important. I have stacks of cases piling up at IB2 right now because my volunteers are not showing up for their office hours, and we're considering trying to find more student fees to hire case managers, and these would be, actually we'd be hiring people to do the job that we're actually trying to get volunteers to do because people are busy. They don't have the time, and we want to ensure that there are trained personnel there to deal with the tenants when they come in these very stressful situations. And it is stressful. Every time someone comes into the tenants union, they're freaking out. They're afraid they're going to be evicted. They're stressed because they haven't had water for 3 days, and their landlord seems to not care about it. And I know on the other side, there are landlords who really need to make sure that their tenants are hearing them, that you can't just build a fire pit in your backyard. It's a hazard, or, you need to take all the laundry down. It's creating an eyesore. And so the mediation really works, and I really hope that that you will support it with general fund money. And I think it works, and it's saving our city money in the long run. Thank you very much.
Emily Allen will be followed by Tim Benson, and then the final speaker will be Lynn Goebel.
Good morning, Madam Mayor and Council. I'll speak to you first on behalf of the South Coast Homeless Advisory Committee. The South Coast Homeless Advisory Committee is concerned about the potential loss of rental mediation services. Homeless prevention is an important component to the effort to reduce homelessness, and we urge you to exhaust all possible avenues to preserve this function. I'll also add, as you look at the staffing function, having volunteered in the past with nonprofits, staff time is also necessary to recruit, to train, and to supervise volunteers. So that's something that you should consider also. The South Coast Homeless Advisory Committee has also supported the restorative policing, and I personally strongly encourage you to ensure that this program does expand. For years, one restorative police officer has been a benefit to our community, and adding outreach workers that report to the officer has the potential to have a very positive impact on efforts to improve a system that we all know is costly and ineffective. Thank you.
Tim Benson.
All right, Madam Mayor, members of the City Council, good morning, and thank you for hearing us out on these issues. I'm here to echo what many of my fellow constituents have already voiced and support the Rental Housing Mediation Task Force and all of their efforts that they have done. I work in the Isla Vista Tenants Union, which is actually the only tenant union in Santa Barbara County, believe it or not. And I can tell you from firsthand experience how much we've relied on mediation agencies in the past to really help us out, advocate both tenants, but also make them more responsible tenants as well. The cases we see are oftentimes conflict between landlords and tenants, and mediation has been a very proven effective method to sort of ease the tensions that commonly exist between these two parties, and mediation works as well. It's been proven effective in my area, as well as it avoids litigation. Many students, coming from a student's perspective, many students as well as low-income renters simply don't have the time or the money to hire an attorney or legal sources. So litigation has always been a very good method to sort of ease that cost, ease the cost of those resources while still providing a service to tenants. We need to maintain this professional program that serves the majority of our residents because it really has been such an important, valuable asset to the residents of this community. And I would just like to echo what all of my fellow constituents have already said. Thank you for your time.
Final speaker will be Lynn Goebel.
Morning, Madam Mayor and members of council. Just real briefly, I think to answer Mr. Hodgkiss, I think what's missing from the budget is that I believe the Rental Housing Mediation Task Force does receive homeless prevention grant funds in the sum of $15,000. I don't think I saw it on the budget, but that might help reduce the shortfall. But for the homeless prevention grant funds, the homeless folks just would go homeless, would remain homeless. So I don't know if that helps ease the shortfall. And then to address Mr. House's comments earlier, I bill my time at $285 an hour, which is actually kind of a low rate for attorneys in this town. I'm an attorney and a mediator. It would seem that I should be against this program because then there'd be more litigation. But I think by reducing and or eliminating the program and the volunteer task force, you are effectively financially attritioning many individuals who take great use of this program because they're unable to afford private mediation at the level that it does indeed cost folks. Thank you.
Thank you. That concludes public comment. Can we get a quick answer to that statement about the homeless prevention and rapid rehousing grant that was just mentioned?
Madam Mayor, the Rental Mediation Task Force Program is one of the partners in the Homeless Prevention and Rapid Rehousing Grant. It's a grant that goes through September 2012. And they do have approximately $15,000 left on the life of the grant. So for the next however many 15 months.
But those funds go directly to individuals, right? I mean, it's not like if this program was cut as proposed in the budget, would those $15,000 still be utilized, and would it just be through staff to allocate those funds? What would happen to those funds, I guess?
If the program went to information only, we would probably have to reallocate that $15,000 to legal aid or another service that will provide assistance to tenants and
So we
landlords.
couldn't use those $15,000 to help offset the general fund subsidy as we were talking about here?
We could. We didn't include it in the budget pages because it's a build program. They have the clients. It's hard to get eligibility for people in the program. Very strict eligibility requirements. The program has done in the past, since it started in 2009, they've averaged just under $1,000 a month in their billings to that program. So there is potential for the next year of $12,000, and that is all city residents that they do serve with that.
But maybe I'm not, okay. But can you use those funds for staffing?
Yes.
You can? Okay.
Yes, but it's billed only. So it's billed for work that's provided. It's not
reimbursement. It's not based on a reimbursement.
It's not an amount of money that's there regardless. They have to do the work to
get the money.
To get the money, yes.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Did you have a question on that, Mr. White?
Thank you. I mean, there must be a way that sounds like an imaginative possibility for starting this let's say we went with a 6-month program and we were able to bill $1,000 a month, that would be $6,000 more dollars to be used in the next increment. Yet we haven't talked about that so far. How many mediations occur each year? Would that be something you would know?
I actually have that information, Madam Mayor, Council Member White. The total program, I've looked at fiscal year 09, fiscal year 10, and annualized fiscal year 11 out. 64 mediations in fiscal year 9, 42 in fiscal year 10, and there's been 24 up through 3/4 of fiscal year 11. Annualized out, that's about 32. Of those, 93%, around 93% for all of those have been for City of Santa Barbara residents. So the majority of the mediations are.
So 40 or so per year. I mean, I'm thinking about Silvio. Looks like he has the number back there, but has.
You have a question for him,
Mr. Dorado? Would you come up to the mic, please?
How many of those are in person and how many are in phone?
I think the number of mediations, it gives you a false feeling, because what really this program is valuable because Andrea really, she services over 1,200 people and she satisfies them and being tenants and landlords, and so that's why I say you get more bang for the buck with this program.
I hear that. I appreciate there's also other services besides the 50 per year.
Thank you.
Mediation. Thank you. Yes, 50 mediations per year that occur. There are other services as well, right?
Yes, and
okay.
I should also note that of the mediations that I just told you, a majority of those are staff mediations, so they're over the phone. The rental mediation specialist will do those herself, or the aides over the phone. The formal mediations, there's much fewer of those per year.
Fewer than 50 per year.
Yeah, I would say probably average one a month.
Okay.
Would be a good average.
Thank you.
Okay, it's to the council for whatever direction we want to, wherever we want to go. Mr. Hotchkiss.
All right, thank you. Okay, so if we cut the budget as Brian has proposed, it would we would retain Andrea. Is that correct? So, and you said she at that point would be information only?
Correct.
So right now she's information plus?
Correct.
Okay. What's the plus? The plus is getting prepared for mediations?
She does a lot of the mediations herself.
Okay.
She spends a lot of time dealing with landlords and tenants one-on-one. She trains her staff to handle the information calls over the phone, and
Right.
she spends a lot of time training the mediators.
Okay, so, but if we didn't have money for staff, she would have a pretty full plate. Can she still do both information and mediations to some degree?
We tried that a couple years ago when the budget was reduced, and it just wasn't viable for one person to be able to do the full range of services.
So what would she do if we cut the staff?
She would provide information only. So she would answer phone calls.
So people
give out
call and say, do I have this right, or what do I do here, or...
And she would give them advice on how to handle it themselves.
Okay, but we still could have the volunteer mediation part?
That is not currently in the budget. That was not
But
proposed.
that's volunteer. Why is that a cost?
The preparing for the meetings, training of the mediators is very time.
But the mediators get trained on their own, they told me.
Most of the training is done by the mediation specialist. She has a training program that she goes through at every meeting, and she does scenarios with them.
Right, but you were a mediator. Could you come up to the dais just for a second?
Goebel.
Thank you. Was this part of your legal training, or did you do it through the mediation task force?
I engaged in the Dispute Resolution Services 30-hour program. I got to drive to Pasadena for a couple of weeks. So I self-trained
Right.
because I believe that mediation is powerful. And
Yeah, no, it is.
I am primarily a litigator, however.
Okay, so I guess we have a mixed bag. Some people are self-trained, and some people are trained by staff.
Yes, that is. Yes, I suppose. I know that Andrea does have a really specific training program that she goes through with all the mediators.
Well, this is a loaded question, but I'll ask both of you. Would you say the service is virtually gutted if we cut back, as some of the people that have been at the dais have said?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Hotchkiss, no, I wouldn't say it's gutted. I think what happens with the facts and figures that Sue brought up regarding the mediations get the bulk of the attention. It's a very important service, but at the same time, when you base that over all the hours that are worked, the information that's provided over the phone represents about 93% of the effort.
Right.
So mediations represents anywhere from 4 to 6% on a per year basis. So you are getting as budgeted, you would be getting rid of the mediation services, which is a small percent of the overall program, but at the same time, that's the that's the percent that gets
a lot of attention.
And what
would
It's
happen
very important.
if we got rid of that? What would happen? Where would that go? How does that get accomplished?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Hotchkiss, that's a great question. A lot of these folks who come to this service can't afford other mediation type services. There are other groups in town that provide those services, but they're usually on one side or another. They either advocate for the tenants or vice versa.
Do you think if we gave full funding for 6 months and said in 6 months it's going to end and it's going to go to just Andrea, you all figure out some program that will really work, and because obviously it's got tremendous value, it's very important, it's just a matter of money, that they could come up with an alternative of some way of doing this? Because as you point out, the mediators are pretty much free, although there's interchange, et cetera, with the staff that's necessary. I'm trying to take both ends of the belt and make them fit on a waist that's too big.
Mayor Schneider, Councilmember Hotchkiss, so what you're asking is if they're given another 6 months, would the program be able to find alternatives and keep the full service? I think in listening to the members of the task force, that they are very interested in doing that and looking at other opportunities. We would continue to look at alternative grant resources. We've already been doing that. Our primary sources of grant funding have been through CDBG over the life of the task force, or the Rental Housing Mediation Task Force program. It is difficult to find grant funding at the current time. I'm not going to be, I'm not going to lie. It's very difficult. There are a lot of folks after that money, and one of the problems that the Rental Housing Mediation Task Force has is it's not a 501c3, so that immediately bumps you out of consideration for a number of grant funds. But there are ways that we can possibly get around that by teaming up with other nonprofits and have them as our fiscal agents. So we are exploring those opportunities, and I think the task force is very much interested in pursuing those types of opportunities over the next 6 months.
Right, and it seems to me that the onus of responsibility does not rest solely with you. If people in the task force understand that, the people that have been such good and strong advocates today, if they could shoulder some of this responsibility and try to make it a joint venture, I could see pushing it forward for another 6 months, but we got to make an adjustment. Unfortunately, I'm just the way it is.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Hotchkiss, we have in the past, and I've mentioned this at our May 2nd meeting, we have in the past looked for alternate funding sources. We have gone to the Rental Properties Association. That's not the right name, but I think you know where I'm getting at, to ask for funding over the previous years. They were unable to do that. Obviously, they're having financial issues as well. I think everybody is, but they were able to offer us free advertising space, which was a positive, and we're very grateful for that. So we continue to look for stakeholders to possibly pony up funds for the program. We had in the past researched a business license fee, and possibly putting an additional fee on your business license for folks who own 4 or more units. That didn't go forward with the passage of Prop 26 this past November of 2010, which requires a 2/3 vote of the people, and we don't think we can get there. So we have been, for a number of years, this isn't just now, we have been for a number of years been exploring alternative sources of funding, knowing that CDBG funds and others are dwindling.
And since there are stakeholders that benefit on both sides, although some have economic distress, maybe that's even at a reduced or a progressive level of income, that all people benefiting from a mediation or a negotiation could to some degree participate, whether it's $25 to get in the door if you're the renter or whatever it is for the landlord. Anyway, these are just ideas, but I do think there are ways of resolving it other than with just public funds.
Can you just follow up on the timing of that in terms of looking towards other grant sources? The timeline of different foundations or other potential sources, they have their own cycle, for example. For example, our own CDBG process for funding through next year, we wouldn't even know until March or so of next year for the following fiscal year. So in your research looking at that kind of grant cycle, is the next 6 months adequate to find and get funding for the following 6 months, or do you need 12 months to really look for funding that will keep it sustainable after 12 months, if you get where I'm going with that?
Madam Mayor, that's a great question, and unfortunately I don't have an answer for that. This is our primary source of grant funding over the years has either been through the city CDBG process, which again culminates in March with decisions by the City Council. We also have relied over the years a great deal on funding from the county as well as the City of Carpinteria, and on a different level from the City of Goleta. All of those
those are all public agencies.
Those
so
are all public.
I'm looking at other foundations or other kinds of funding sources. Are there, in your research, are you, for example, applying for a grant and you'll know before the end of the year if you got the grant?
Unfortunately, I don't know enough about the grant process and what is out there, because we've never had to go to this level to get funds.
You're not at the point of actually applying for grants at this point. You're just researching what's even out there.
That's what staff is tasked with doing, yes.
All right. Mr. Rouse.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I can see where Mr. Hotchkiss and some of the rest of us are going with this. And I have to say also that having been in business for a while and having gone through every level of litigation, unfortunately, that entails, there's, it's amazing the amount of money that would be saved by preserving a program like this for all parties concerned. I'm still a little confused as to why this cost is zero for everybody concerned. Not everybody concerned in these processes are indigent or without money. So there must be some kind of a fee recovery plan and or sliding scale that could apply to this. And what I'd like to see is, number one, I'd like to see this program preserved in some way or another for some period of time. But I'd also like to see a proposal from the task force regarding those types of potential revenues, along with you just had a discussion about grants and potential out there. And I realize the time window might be too short. But it seems to me that if somebody is a multi-unit owner and or a tenant who is well heeled, but I mean they could take advantage of this for absolutely nothing, as opposed to these horrendous attorney costs. And how fair is that? Now you want to have everybody have the advantage and have everybody have access, and I think there could be some qualification or sliding scale like a lot of programs have. But to have this absolutely 100% dependent on other types of funds outside of the program without any kind of fee recovery seems a little strange to me. So now I realize also that the actual mediation activities are only, as you said, 4 or 5% of the activity of the function. Is that correct, Mr. Bossing?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Rouse, the numbers that we came down with as far as how many hours are spent, mediation, both on the phone as well as in person, represent anywhere from 4 to 7% on an annual basis.
Right. But as a community, keeping people out of the courts and out of the system is a benefit to everybody. I think, we could all agree on that. How do we fund that? And obviously we're looking under all the cushions for nickels right now for everything anyway. So I would love to see some creative input from this obviously very dedicated task force and the staff on other ways we could do that, whether it be grant funding, writing, or some proposal on a fee scale, and of course the partnerships with other types of 501c3 type organizations. So I would be currently in favor of a 6-month period of approval in order to, I realize we can't accomplish all the grants in that time, but at least have a counter proposal as to more creative ways to look at the whole pie and see if
Can
we
I
can
just
get that
ask you then, because I understand the rationale behind the 6 months to get things moving and saying we're serious and you got to find something else, but are we saying at the end of 6 months we're going to review? What if they have something in progress but they don't have the funding starting January 1? Are we going to then reassess and then allocate another 6 months worth of funding and then make a final determination a year from now? Or, I mean, it makes me, I kind of feel like they need 12 months to figure out the program, maybe with a 6-month review coming back to council of where they are. But if we set them up so that funding just sort of ends December 31st, with plans in place but nothing implemented yet, we're sort of setting them up for failure. And,
yeah, I mean, that is, Madam Mayor, where I'm kind of headed, because once again, the reality of the time period. But I think a review and some measurable goals. Now that the other issue with saying, well, you've got this 12 months worth of funding, it takes a lot of the incentive away to be creative. So I'm not sure how we can do both things. I understand your point as far as budgeting goes.
Right.
But I would like to see some type of input from the task force about how they could possibly creatively fund outside of coming to these different agencies for funding.
So there could be, for example, funding for 6 months secured now, and then a potential funding for another 6 months pending affirmative of review from us towards by the end of the year to show that things, if not already in place, are imminent in place. So if they need that bridge funding, but in order for the budget,
right,
we need to know what to do with the budget.
That's essentially what I had in mind, but I'm not really sure how to craft that.
And I don't know if staff can help with that, but that I can see somewhere, because I think they're going to need the full 12 months, and we'll know is it going to stay or go. Well, we'll have to figure that out. I see where you're going, though. Mr. House.
This is a big budget. It's amazing how much we're not discussing today. I mean, just in terms of how much is not, it's sort of settled. We kind of have at least I think we have a sense that most of the department's presentations have, a lot of the concerns that we raised got answered right then, and we're moving forward. And so first I want to appreciate the department heads and administration for the work you've done to get us here. Now we've got a few things we need to really wrestle to the ground. On this one, Ms. Gray, this had been a 2 full-time position at a point when it was really going along for a number of years, correct?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember House, that is correct. At one time, I believe when I first started supervising the program, it was 2 full-time and 2 part-time.
Right, and that was when, and one of the things I recall when that was reduced pretty significantly in terms of staffing, there was you all were keeping track of the calls that couldn't be answered.
Correct. Yes.
And I remember it was pretty appalling how many people literally couldn't even get through to get their questions answered. We have no idea what kind of situations they were facing and what happened then.
Correct. We started keeping track of that when we had our last budget reduction, and we tried it with just 1 full-time staff person. And so we started tracking the missed calls. They were high then. She's gotten her temporary part-time help, and they've gone down.
Thank
There's
goodness we restored
some
those
missed.
2 part-time positions so that we're able to catch all the calls.
Not all of them, but it's gone down. Yes.
I think this is really important to say. This is, I don't see this as an optional program, and you've heard me speak to this before. In a city that's majority renters, this is just not an optional program. This is a fundamental, really basic, very low-cost private-public partnership service that we need to provide. And I think, Mr. Rouse, one of the things that I'm glad you bring up the issue of why, sliding scale or whatever. I think that's an interesting thing. There is a little bit of a problem here. This is not a mandatory program for participation, right? Both parties have to voluntarily decide to participate, correct?
Correct. The actual provision of information, that's pretty much whoever calls gets their information answered. For the mediations, it's definitely you need both parties willing.
Yeah, I mean, I have a sense there probably are some people who are participating in this program and who appreciate it, who do have the means. On the other hand, the renters in our city, many of them aren't of means, and they are really quite at a disadvantage when the larger companies are, really have the resources. But then again, why would they participate? What would be one of the big selling points has been, hey, look, this doesn't cost anything. You guys come together. Let's see if we can work this out. And that's been a pitch that's worked to get people together, right?
Yes, I believe it has. I think that if the rental mediation task force looks at different options, I think they're probably the best group to decide whether they should be charged on a sliding scale or, how it worked, because they have that expertise.
Well, I'm sure open to that, and I think that they should be given the opportunity to do that. On the other hand, it's just amazing the scale of our budget in this one particular very small program that produces such tremendous results, and it is truly a public-private partnership in the way that we've all been asking, couldn't the volunteers do this or that? But they're already doing it. It's a well-established, solid program for 35 years that has been delivering these goods. So I just say those things out loud so you know where I stand on it. But I hope we all can come for at least this next year at the funding that would allow it to continue. But I think the city only is important. I also don't think we should give up on, it's full cost recovery for the county, and it also then would help us pay for information only, $25,000. That would help pay for those part-time workers. We're not increasing above what you've proposed with 1 full-time and 2 part-time. But on the other hand, they would be available and have that additional source of resources. I think we should go for that. And then just to switch gears real quick on the police proposal. I support the police chief's recommended budget. I support the budget that has come to us. I know it's a stretch, and it's not. We really have had to really look to see where we'll get that additional funding. But I like the new approach of putting non-sworn but technically qualified folks in positions where they can do jobs that free up our existing sworn resources. I like the additional, I love the additional restorative policing officer. I think that's really important, and the merchants in downtown and Milpas and all around, they're going to really appreciate that, and the more enhanced presence on the street. And I appreciate Deputy Chief Mannix answering my questions about dispatch, because it's really important that the budget allow the resources that they need to get that back up to its full strength as well. That's probably the key to our quick response time that we've been having. So I support but I do not support going beyond that. When I look at what the staff has given us as where the sources of funding would be for going beyond what the police department has recommended, I think the cost is too high to the other programs. I do not think we should go beyond. I think the problem is we're setting ourselves up for a structural deficit problem that's bigger than we can really. It sounds so appealing to just add more police, but when we get to next year and the year after and the year after, we're using one-time money this year, and to set us up with a structural problem even worse than what we already have, that is not responsible. So I will not be supporting additional beyond what the police chief is recommending. Thank you.
Just to be clear, if the county does want to give us $25,000 for information only, we're not going to refuse that, right? That's not your recommendation.
Madam Mayor, that's correct.
Okay.
And that would pay for an additional part-time person.
Okay, but it'd be for the county stuff. And,
Exactly.
Right.
For there. And can I just not correct, but elaborate a little bit on the homeless prevention rapid rehousing grant
yes.
again? What council asked for was us to come back with what it would cost for City of Santa Barbara residents only. I didn't count the HPRP monies because it's billable only. However, if you wanted to look at that, what I was thinking was it would just, whatever council appropriated, whatever we billed would just go back to the general fund.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it would kind of supplant it.
Right.
So, but if you wanted to take that into your calculations, $1,000 a month for that would be a good estimate.
Thank you for that clarification. Ms. Self.
Thank you. I too agree that 6 months is a good window. We may not have grant opportunities in that time, but we'll definitely see if our economic strength is improving in the city, and being able to make it on those grounds that we're getting more TOT, more sales tax, and that we can reallocate. And also it does put a timeline on things. I'm definitely with the mayor that to come back and review it. It's not in 6 months, the door closes. It's, okay, let's come back. And I wanted to thank the volunteers and also thank for the creative ideas we're getting about how things are working. And when I met with Miss Allen before, I don't know if I missed the link that I was going to get about 501c3 opportunities for people to donate to this program. And I think had we had some sort of sliding scale fee, that we wouldn't be in quite as bleak a territory right now, more like squirreling away something for the future and looking at this. And I agree, it's a very useful program. And as far as the sliding scale, many of our other services in town have sliding scale fees, so we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We can see what seems appropriate through other like services and maybe be slightly under what they are. But I think I'm definitely talk to my kids. You get something, you got to give something. It's just the way the world works and the way the world should work. And of course take out of there those who are in the direst of straits who can't. But that is not the majority of the community. And regarding the county fees, if it's full cost recovery, it does nothing to add to what we're talking as far as city services. That fund, if I'm understanding it right, pays for added services that we're giving to someone else. So it just, it's not a plus here. But what is that plus would be that $1,000 a month billable to this that we could reallocate here. And as far as the using something from the golf course or any other enterprise funds, the fees used at the golf course are paying for the upgrades at the golf course, at the waterfront, at the airport. So I don't think we can rob from that Peter to pay Paul. And talking about fee increases, any fee increases, especially on something that serves the very lowest echelon of our society, those fees are passed on. So in essence, they're paying the fee to pay for a fee to, it's a cyclical thing. And so I think whenever we impose a fee, we need to consider the impacts of that fee. And, but I definitely would support 6 months with reviewing it based on our economic strength and the performance of the program. Are we able to kind of creatively shift things? And again, thank you for all the creative ideas. And then back to some other budgetary items. I am not and have never been for browning out fire station. We have good coverage, and I think that is part of public safety. We need to take care of our people here. I support the police reallocation of resources. Again, we're getting creative. Woo! That is the really bonus of downtime to find other ways to work things out. And as far as even looking for more police officers, if we had 150 at one time, I don't think working to that end is a bad thing. One of the things that had come up about one of the reasons for some of our traffic calming was that we didn't need police officers to give tickets. And I say, okay, you've got that corner covered. What about all the other corners? And, if people are speeding and doing things they shouldn't be, I am all for catching them, and we can increase those fees. I'm all for those fees going up. But I think I've covered it. Thank you.
Mr. Francisco?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Mr. Samario, could you please put up the slide that had the summary of the rental housing task force costs?
So this is the slide that shows for city services only, full service, 6 months and 12 months.
And also there was a slide previous to that that had the original and
So both of these reflect a reduction in services from what's currently being provided this year.
Right. So we're talking about basically part of this is due to the reduction in funding from other agencies.
That is
$30K
correct.
approximately.
Actually, we see a reduction of $8,000 from the City of Carpinteria, and then a reduction of funding from CDBG just because of the fact that we're getting less money from them.
Okay.
And also that $60,000 you see there where it says City of Santa Barbara, that was in the original budget, that already was reduced from prior years because of reductions in CDBG and also where we could use the money. So it was actually much higher in the current year.
Okay. Now, the part-time positions, those are hourly positions without benefits, correct?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Francisco, yes, that is correct.
Okay. And the duties of those part-timers, is it purely the informational part, the answering the phones part?
No, they do a little bit of the mediations too, just depending on how far along they are in their training and, you know, what Andrea feels that they can deal with.
Okay. And for the full-time position, the 108K, how much of that is salary and how much is benefits?
Gosh, I would say probably, what do we consider, like 30% benefits?
Yeah, it's probably a 70-30 split.
Okay. Part of where I'm going on this is we know that there are many other communities that have these kinds of services, but they're not city-provided services. They're provided by local nonprofits. And at least, and this is not at all meant to denigrate any of current staff and what they're up to. These are positions that we asked for and funded the way we funded them. But based on my understanding of what this position entails, what the full-time position entails, I feel pretty confident that in the private sector, or including the nonprofit sector, there would be people who would be willing and capable of doing that work for less than $80K in salary. I feel highly confident of that, especially in this economy. So what I'm wondering is, what is the possibility of the city working with local nonprofits to fund positions at a nonprofit that would do this work, but more in line with the cost structure that most of our local nonprofits are used to working with, which would not be at this level?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Francisco, I think that could probably be one of the options that come back to you after 6 months. And I think the task force, that would be something that they could look at.
Okay. And I think some combination of salary cost reduction here. And when I say that, we're talking about from what is a pretty high level. And again, I feel confident that there are plenty of people in our local nonprofit sector who would be happy to work doing this work, because it is important work. It's important work for the community, and no one doubts the benefit of it. But I also believe it's important to keep in mind that out of this total budget, apparently we're talking about somewhere between 4 to 6% of the workload goes into the most professionalized, if you will, aspect of this work, the mediation, the actual mediation itself. And I would love to see the work of the Rental Housing Mediation Task Force continue. I think it is a great service to the community. But looking at what the city's responsibilities are and what our responsibilities are to provide to our constituents, I think this is something that might be better suited to the nonprofit sector, and I would be happy to support continued city funding to make that happen. I just think it could be done for less cost. So I think perhaps some combination of that and what Mr. Rouse has proposed, I think a sliding fee scale makes perfect sense. I don't see why this needs to be a completely free program for everyone. Certainly there are people in a financial situation where the sliding scale for them would be 0, and that's fine. But I also believe that there are plenty of landlords and tenants who would be happy to pay something for this program compared to the cost of going into litigation. So I think that something along the lines of 6 months funding with strong direction from council that we want to find a more cost-effective way to provide these services, that would be my position. So, moving on from that to the police department budget, this is obviously one of the biggest parts of our budget as a city, and a lot of very complex issues here. And as we've been discussing this, first I want to say to Mr. Armstrong and to Chief Sanchez, I really appreciate the work that you've done trying to find some creative solutions here. I think the money from the RDA for restorative policing and for outreach workers is a great idea. I fully support it. I also think that the proposed civilianizing of 2 positions is a great idea. I would like to continue looking for more opportunities for civilianizing work within the police department, every opportunity possible to get sworn officers currently on the force, liberating them for patrol rather than from office work. So anything that we can find out there that will do that. And I understand Deputy Chief Mannix's comment about the advantages of having someone with direct police experience. Unfortunately, we're not in a luxury situation with the budget, and so we're going to have to make some sacrifices there. So everything we can do in terms of finding other areas where there's opportunities for substituting civilians in jobs that sworn officers are currently doing, that's fantastic. However, good as those things are, and I'm fully supportive of them, that does not change the fundamental reality that in 10 years we've gone from a authorized sworn strength of 152 officers to what we have today, 137. And to me, the provision of public safety remains our first duty. And that's something that we as a council have an absolute responsibility to take care of, whether the economic times are tough or good. So I think it would be fantastic if our authorized sworn strength were back at 150. That's not going to happen this year, but it does need to increase. And so we do need to look at ways, and again, Mr. Armstrong, I appreciate your laying out some of the possibilities for where we can find money. What we need to look at this year is an increase in the authorized strength, and I'm not sure what that number should be. But as I've said before, 137 is not acceptable. We have to be realistic about how many people we can bring online, how quickly. So I think we're talking about not 10 positions, but probably 4 or 5. We also need to think about what kind of civilian support staff capabilities there might be that would increase the efficiency of the sworn staff that we have today. Another question I had is when we look at hiring new officers, I'd like to get a clear picture of what the budget impact is in the first year and then the out years. Obviously, when we decide to increase the authorized sworn strength, we don't get those officers overnight unless we get laterals. So I would like to understand what the ramp-up costs are for new entry-level patrol officers, including, obviously, the average salary and benefits and overtime once they have gone through the academy and through field training and are fully functioning. I think we may also need to look at, I hate to have yet another City Council subcommittee, but I think given the complexity of this issue and the importance of the police department to city services as a whole and obviously to the city budget, this might be a good area to appoint a subcommittee of the council whose work is going to be going on for some time to work with the police department to come up to really aggressively push efficiency improvements in any way we can within the department. And as far as I'm concerned, everything's on the table. Everything from how we're doing the work of the police department, and that includes things as, some of us, I'm sure, have heard comments from officers on patrol about the extraordinary amount of time that they spend on paperwork, on writing reports, seeing can we find some way to transfer some of that workload to clerical staff. Everything from the efficiency of day-to-day operations all the way to meta issues within the department. And again, this is no criticism of the current force structure or the people doing the jobs, but we may need to look, for instance, at reducing the size of command staff. Our command staff is the most expensive part of the police department, And the patrol staff, those are the people out on the street. Those are the ones doing the essential services that people see and need every day. And the number of people on patrol, that is what determines response time. So there's a whole range of issues that I think we need to look at within the police department. And this is not something that is going to be finished by July 1st. I think it would be useful for the council to appoint a subcommittee to work with police and explore every avenue that's out there for increasing the efficiency of the department that is the largest department in fiscal terms out of the general fund. So those are my thoughts. I realize, and I've gotten emails from many people in the community who think that any money that we can wring out of the general fund should be spent on social services rather than law enforcement. And I just want to say again, the amount of money that this city spends on social services is astonishing. And I personally, just this year, have supported what I think are absolutely vital expansions in social services. A good example is the detox center. It's something I think we need as a city. It's something that I have personally supported, working on the subcommittee to find, working with our RDA staff, with Mayor Schneider, the Housing Authority. We worked diligently for more than a year to help find a good location for that. So that's sort of, and the expenditure of city funds on that was something that I fully supported. But we have to realize that there are a lot of people in this city, the majority, I believe, who feel that the public environment is deteriorating, that they feel unsafe in many parts of our city. We also have to realize that there's a limit to people's patience when it comes to supporting social services. One of the things that happened when we found a location for the detox center is we had quite a bit of opposition in the neighborhood to citing that. We also had enormous neighborhood concern over another city project, which I supported, for transitional housing for homeless people on Outer State Street. So I think that public sentiment is that the city of Santa Barbara is doing plenty, perhaps more than its share. When you look at those Common Ground survey results that I alluded to a few weeks ago, and you see that the city of Santa Maria only has a quarter as many homeless people as the city of Santa Barbara. You have to wonder, why is that? I think it's fairly clear to most people, including people actually working in the field, that more support services encourage more people to be supported. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't also a fraction of the people who are out there on the street who need help and who cannot help themselves. And I've said that again and again. We need to find solutions for those people. But we also need to realize that there is an issue of moral hazard here. And the more free things that you offer to people, there's always a segment of the population that's happy to take advantage of those as long as they're on offer. So we have to target our limited funds for social services to the people who genuinely need it. And I'm fully supportive of that, but we also need to make sure that those funds are targeted to the people who need the most help and the people who are from Santa Barbara, not from people all over the state, not from people all over the country. So that's, just to sum that up, I think we're headed in the right direction here. I think that with the rental housing, can we find a shorter word for that? With the task force, I think the direction that we're going here is a good one. I obviously want to see the work of the task force continue. We just need to find a way to do it more economically. And also, I believe, again, Mr. Armstrong, Chief Sanchez, I thank you for the work that you've done so far. I think you're headed in the right direction on the police department budget. But I also, my bottom line is that we need to increase the authorized strength. Thanks.
Mr. White.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Well, if I understood Mr. Francisco's comments, I understood Mr. Francisco to say that he supports the 3 full-time sworn officers this year. You're not proposing to go to 5. this year, are you?
What I'm proposing is that we change the authorized sworn strength from 137 to 141, 42, with the eventual goal of getting further.
And staff's recommendation is that we go from 137 to 140. Is that correct?
No.
No, the net effect would be 138 because the other two, where you civilianize them, you don't add any sworn folks.
All right. Okay. All right. Well, I support staff's recommendation on this. I think it's, I don't think we've seen even the results of the ramp up that's been in effect the last 2 years. It's just, I think we're still going to see some better, I mean, we're seeing some better response. At least I see it on the ground when in the areas, I'm more in the Milpas Cabrillo area, but I see more effective response in that area these days. So I really appreciate, again, staff's creative way of handling this situation. Taking RDA money, I support that, and the civilianization, I support that as a way to get more boots on the ground. And then with the rental mediation task force, I support the 6 months. I support a 6-month review with the hope that, number one, we've got, when I'm looking at these numbers, we take the 12,000 grant money, we're looking at 30 net to the general fund and then 61 net to the general fund for a year. I would hope that we can reduce that 60 to the general fund with sliding scale fees. I think stakeholder fees it just seems to me as one of the ways to approach it. I don't know whether, well, again, there's a zillion ways to attack it, but I'd leave that to staff to come up with what you think is a marketable way to do that, and start that as soon as you can. I mean, start chewing on that sooner than later. It'll just mean that we'll be that 61 that we're talking about. That the next, let's say we were able to get that down to 15 for the second half of the year instead of 30. That's a step in the right direction. So I look forward to. I would support a 6-month review of this, and with the intent of winnowing down that general fund contribution in the second half.
Mr. Hotchkiss.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Just to the rental housing mediation task force, I would love to see the names shorter also, but I would like you to understand that 6 months when we do the review, one possibility of the review is to cut sharply as was originally proposed here. So, and I say that just so that you'll take it seriously in your efforts to come up with alternatives such as the progressive billing, et cetera, that we're talking about. So the value of what you do is absolutely obvious. So, but we just need to figure out how to finance it. So thank you for your cooperation on that. I see some nodding heads. I appreciate it. Insofar as the police are concerned, let me ask Chief, if I could ask a question. I was having a power lunch at Hamburger Habit on State Street yesterday, and there was a couple there, actually two or three groups sitting at the outside patio, and a guy hanging over him who would not go away, who was just, I don't want to say drooling, but he was obnoxious. And I was weighing whether I should say something or not. Eventually I told the manager. He came out and just yelled at the guy and got him to move on, which is great as far as I was concerned. But I think that if there had been a man with a badge such as yourself standing there, that guy would have taken one look and been history. I'm wondering, though, on this civilian program that we've got they sound like hosts or whatever, what is their ability going to be? Are they going to be able to tell a guy like that to move on? Are they going to be able to be sharp with somebody like that? Or are they supposed to go, gee, what's your problem? What's the deal?
Well, I think that they're going to play a variety of roles. Clearly, the eyes and ears, they're going to have radios with them. They're going to be ready, accessible to the community. They don't have arrest powers unless they arrest them, citizens arrest of some type. Many times it's best not to address them harshly because that just sets them off. I think we need to look at other ways. Even the officers aren't, hopefully not going to do that. Sometimes our presence does deter it. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it makes it a little bit hotter than you want it to be. Every situation is different. But the role that they're going to play is going to be very huge in terms of assisting our officers on both corridors, Milpas and State Street, by being the eyes and ears and calling that officer over there much more quickly with a radio, calling dispatch if it's a 911 emergency. I think they're going to play a great role, and I think their presence is going to be equally important, even though they're not wearing a gun and a badge.
Thank you. Well, I agree to do all of what the staff recommends, but I also agree with Mr. Francisco that we got to look beyond. And I do think we should set a target that has a 150 written on it. And I would like to do, I hate to volunteer for it, but some ad hoc committee that would work with the police and the city council to try to get there and not just come up and make all our decisions here. Yes, please.
Well, I'd love to be at 150. There's no doubt about it.
Right.
Whenever we get there, it would be fantastic.
Right.
Clearly, you know, there are a lot of things we want to do that we're attempting to do that we can't get to sometimes, and sometimes it takes bodies to do it. I think at some point, if we get to that number in the next couple of years, if that'd be an outstanding goal to get to, and we're ready to work towards that end. You know, every year we get a number when we get our budget, and we have to work with that number, and we have to make adjustments, which we have, and meet with the city administrator and Mr. Samario to make those adjustments. This year we've got again another great partnership with community development, who's assisting us with the restorative policing piece. So there's teamwork going on. But do I want to be at 150? Yeah, yesterday. But we also realize the reality that we're one player in the sandbox here. So
right. Well, let's
hopefully we can get there.
Let's work toward it. Thank you very much.
Mr. Rouse?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I didn't comment on the police part last time. You know, as we look towards extra enforcement or extra presence, as Mr. Armstrong said, I think that in itself, we proved that with the Bob Casey pilot program the downtown organization ran in cooperation with the city parking department. Just having Officer Casey back on as a retiree on the street reduced issues tremendously, both on the street and in the parking structures, and parking staff can attest to that. Presence is everything, and I really appreciate the creativity of both the administrative offices and the PD about finding ways to get the presence back up. To me, though, 150 is not a magic number. As Deputy Chief Mannix talked about, I think 157 was the absolute maximum strength we had at one point in time. If you scheduled out to every shift and every TPF manning requirement, that's where we would be. We're obviously woefully short of that, and we're stressing our officers with extra OT requirements and safety issues without having some backup support from time to time. In terms of what we're doing in the budget, I see this as an economic issue as well. Our basic economy is very much dependent on having people downtown spending money in retail shops. Tax revenue, TOT are the drivers of all the programs we're talking about. However we're going to fund any kind of general fund program, whether it be Parks and Rec or the rental task force, is dependent on us being able to grow the pie, as Mr. Romasan likes to say. Well, we can't do that if we have a reputation and a reality that people feel unsafe or that they feel the downtown is unclean. And we have to make this effort. This is an investment. This is like saying, business is down, I'm going to cut my advertising. Well, that's not what you do. I think we have to reestablish our presence on the street. And I'm not talking about trying to arrest our way out of everything or anything. An officer's presence on the street just by being there is a huge difference. This volunteer program is also going to help. There's nothing like having a cop, no doubt about it. But eyes on the prize are what we're talking about. Restorative policing is great to direct people who are in needs of services to the proper services. We're not talking about restoring everybody that's on the street. And everybody in this room knows that. There's a lot of scofflaws that need to be dealt with. And there's a lot of people that need to know that there's a presence on the street that's authoritative and is willing to act. And I think if we just get that presence back out there, we're going to see the return in terms of tax revenue and our businesses. These small businesses employ a lot of folks in town. You talk about homeless issues. Well, if you're employed or if you're unemployed, you're probably closer to being homeless than if you're employed. And as employers cut jobs in this economy, and as our people who live in this town go to Camino Real to shop because they say, well, we'll not go downtown anymore. I mean, it makes me sad to hear these people that said that they no longer include State Street as part of their tour package when they bring folks into town. That's really disturbing testimony. And we hear it every day. We hear it from folks that live here. We're not just talking about folks coming in as tourists. We're talking about people who live in this community who have now kind of taken State Street off their list of places to go and visit. That's a really sad result. We've got to turn that around. And I think we are going to turn that around, starting with the programs that you have helped us to initiate. But I think we have to go further. And I think it's really important. I think it's a big investment, but I think it's an essential investment. I don't think we can do what we need to do for the other programs without making this program work and getting our economic engine back up to where it needs to be. So, I don't know, Madam Mayor, are we going to do a couple of motions when it comes to this budget today, or is it going to be one big motion? Or
I haven't spoken yet, and there's still some lights on, and
right.
I think I can. We might want to do a couple of motions.
I wasn't prepared to make a motion. I'm just kind of curious how I'm still the new guy here, as you may recall. But I do firmly believe that we should take on the suggested staff recommendations for police enhancement, in addition to ramping up the the authorized positions as a matter of policy. And I have to agree with Mr. Francisco that I think a subcommittee, like we need some more meetings, but a subcommittee to deal with this is going to be essential to target these issues, to determine within the budget where we can find funding, and to work with the police department to move towards enhancing this force as quickly as we can. Thank you.
Thank you. I know your light's on, but okay. First off, thank you everyone for being here, and those watching for your emails and so forth. And I think your message is heard loud and clear, especially as it relates right now to the Rental Housing Mediation Task Force and the value of it. I'm pleased to hear, at the very least, a 6-month continuance. Might be little differences of opinion of what to do after that, but I think not just to cut it off as of July 1 is a good thing, and I think due to a lot of education on our part of what the value of the Rental Housing Mediation Task Force is, and the potential of what could happen if it just goes away completely very quickly after 35 plus years of very successful work. I do want to, there were some comments about only 4% is the real, professional side of things. I look at it as that's because so much great professional work was done to avoid the mediation from happening. And I kind of think of looking at it like good business practice, and in my human resources background is you don't want to go to a judge or an administrative law attorney. You want to figure it out before it gets to that point. And that's a lot of the work of the staff, that's the work the staff is doing to try to avoid the more tense and potential litigious or other kinds of extreme situations that might not have a good outcome. So it's hard to measure things that don't happen. It's hard to measure how many lawsuits did we avoid or how many evictions did we avoid by doing good work. But I think that 96% of the work that is done, if you take the program as a whole, is showing that the going beyond information only has a huge value to it in terms of the relationships between tenants and landlords in our community. And I think it's important to recognize that the majority of Santa Barbara residents are tenants, and this is a big issue. The example of a few years ago on Modoc Road with the 204 residents that was brought up earlier, I remember going through that process, and it was tense like you wouldn't believe, and it was only because, I think, of the Rental Housing Mediation Task Force that both the landlords and the tenants were able to find a solution that worked for everyone. It wasn't ideal for everyone, but it worked for everyone, and so that value is really important. My personal concern of just contracting out to any nonprofit that may want to take it is it may deter from the neutrality of that value of having a neutral party. I don't know of a neutral nonprofit in town, like, you know, purely neutral that could play that role. Most nonprofits that would have this kind of expertise tend to have one, not bias, but one focus rather than another, and so that voluntary nature of making it work, you know, could be problematic. Plus, the city wouldn't have much control over what happens to it once it's contracted out to another organization with its own board of directors and policies. And frankly, I think just contracting it out in the long term will make it a lot easier for a future council to just to cut the funding altogether, even though the intent of this council is that it should be funded with city funds, although trying to find how to make that work. So those are just my initial kind of concerns about the automatic contract out option. But I do think what we should do is give the task force a chance to figure out how to become financially sustainable in the long term. And that's why I was asking about, I don't want to just do a 6-month and then it cuts off and set them up for failure. I think there are probably going to be some options that would be initiated in the first 6 months but might not be implemented completely until maybe a year later. So I think what could work, and what I'm hearing from my colleagues, see if this would work out, is to put in the budget under the line item Rental Housing Mediation Task Force the 6-month amount, but then also under appropriated reserves, for example, put the other 6 months that will only be allocated to the Rental Housing Mediation Task Force after a successful 6-month review. Because somehow we need to put the money in the budget somewhere. And if it's in the appropriated reserves, it's not an automatic, right? You have to earn it. And that's what I think I'm hearing from some of my colleagues after 6 months of where are we going, and given that incentive to do that in 6 months. But it then also, having it in under appropriated reserves gives us the opportunity in 6 months to give some or all additional funding for the second 6 months based on what we hear, and without having to find new money somewhere that's not in the budget. So that would be my suggestion on how to move forward with the rental housing mediating task. And I think, you know, this, for 5 years, it's relied solely on public money, and it's really solely from a little bit from county and other cities, but really from HUD and from the federal government. And we just can't rely on that one source. So diversifying the revenue streams somehow, it's going to be important in order to keep that program sustainable on a financial basis, and I know this group of people could figure that out, you know, at least to get it started and have some strong options there. So I think that would be my suggestion on how that would work. Before I get to the police department budget, I have one other item that hasn't been brought up yet, except by Chair Wiscombe from the Parks and Rec Department. The Mesa Lane steps. What is there, or maybe Ms. Rapp, you might know this, or Mr. Samario, what is the budget to renovate the Mesa Lane steps? Is it over $200,000 or whatever's left over in appropriated reserves? Is that a portion of what would be needed and can be used as a local match with outside grants? What is that number? Ms. Rapp.
Madam Mayor and council members, the cost of Phase 2, which would be construction, is $650,000.
Okay, so even if we put all the appropriated reserves into the Mesa Lane steps, that would not cover the construction cost?
No, but we do believe that it would give us a greater advantage when it comes to securing grant funding, because we've seen a lot of potential grant sources dry up.
Okay.
And so it does position us in a stronger way.
By having that local match. And
yes.
We've seen that with bridge replacements and road funding and all that good stuff.
Yes.
So I want to throw this out to, thank you. I want to throw this out to my colleagues for consideration, and let me figure out the police department, put that aside, and then for a moment. But there is still some appropriated reserves, extra appropriated reserves here to the tune of a few $100,000 or close to that. Whatever that number is, minus the take out the rental housing mediation task force and take out the 2 administrative positions from the PD for now, what's that number?
Madam Mayor, if you look up at the screen, that reflects those adjustments. On your handouts, this number, I think you have a different number, but these are the correct numbers, 438.45. What you do have available after all the adjustments that we've talked about and the recommendations is $267,000 of ongoing money. And keep in mind that $200,000 of that is what we've sort of earmarked for the overhiring of the police department. So we see that as being an important number, particularly this coming year, because I think we're going to probably need to get into that or tap into that. So on an ongoing basis, we'd have, in my estimation, about $67,000 available. And then we also have the one-time money, which is the $200,000 we freed up, minus the 6 months for the rental housing mediation task force funding. So that's
The
the
163?
So that's one-time funding.
Okay. I mean, one option is to do something like similar to what I'm suggesting with the rental housing mediation task force for the second 6 months, which is to put in, because it's all going to be based on grant funding, and if there was a line item in appropriated reserve saying if you got a grant and needed local match, here's a place for it. But if you couldn't get the grant or if it didn't work, then it's still in appropriated reserves that could be more flexible. That might give Parks and Rec additional assistance in their need to find that added cost, and it'll be a lot more than the money that we're putting in for that local match. I don't, if I'm making sense there. The Mesa Lane, it's been sorely needed for many years, and I think if we looked at the budget, it would have been nice to have the playground budget already paid for with RDA funds, so we could talk about, the other needs in Parks and Rec that's outside the RDA zone for the capital part to it. But I think there's a good point being made by the Parks and Rec Commission that I would be willing to sort of set aside if they get a grant. And if they don't, then it's still there in appropriated reserves. But that would be another incentive for them to get a grant, and it can come back to us, and we could move those funds from appropriated reserves to the Parks and Rec Department budget for that grant. That might, I guess, give a green light in essence of, and I would think would help the application process. So that's a suggestion I'd like to throw out there. And then finally on PD, I thank everyone's comments on there both today and during the police department budget hearing, and the additional, it wasn't mentioned, we got some significant extra information we asked for at that meeting, and I appreciate that. It's interesting, the perception and reality of what's going on. If you look at statistics and you look at how you feel and what's going on and what kind of reaction you get or feedback you get from residents, they don't always mesh. If you look at the Part 1 crimes report, we got the 20-year history of Part 1 crimes. The number of Part 1 crimes when we had 152 authorized positions is pretty darn close to what we have right now. So meaning the number of officers does not necessarily say there's less crime or more crime. But again, I want to emphasize how people feel and wanting to be safe and feeling safe, and their interactions in certain situations is very valid and needs to be addressed. So my point being, there's no magic number in terms of a number of authorized positions. I do think what's being proposed is really good. I'm really looking forward to the restorative policing expansion. I think that's going to yield huge results, especially we just saw the grand jury report about mental ill people in the jails and how that's not working, and to have a more coordinated approach on interacting with mentally ill individuals on the streets, as opposed to just sending them to jail back and forth. This will help in that regard. We saw that already with Officer Casey and Officer Hove, and to expand that, I think, is going to be really positive. The host or the non-sworn part of this, I think, as you said, eyes and ears on the streets, just the presence there will have a huge impact on not just State Street, but the waterfront and Lower Milpas Street as well. I think that's really good. And then having the extra boots on the ground, the extra sworn officers who are doing administrative work, I think it's worth trying that out. I know there is a value of having sworn officers take those positions, but I think given, as Deputy Chief Mannix says, to weigh those out, let's do that. So my question, the one thing about what the number is, And I've heard a number of my colleagues saying we need to get to 150. Okay, I guess my view is, and I said this during the police budget review, is that for me to add more to the budget, I need to know how we're going to pay for it. And I don't feel like I've heard a recommendation today that fits or that works, or the list that was given as options being ones that would help. In fact, it might harm us in terms of increasing the structural deficit that we have. I do think that we do need to get to a little more, we do need to get above 138. I don't know if 150 is the magic number. And my thought process is looking at what people value in terms of beyond patrol positions, the DARE officer, the PAL officer, the beat coordinators. And over the course of many years, we've had enough, then we've had to reallocate. We've put them back, we've taken them off. I'm tired of that. And it'd be good to have whatever that number is so that we can have 3 minimum beat coordinators, a PAL and a DARE person all the time without having to go back and forth. So that to me has value to it in terms of then how our sworn officers can interact with the public, how community policing works, and so forth. I still don't hear how today we can pay for it. And I hear there's about a subcommittee. Before I go into another subcommittee that sounds like it's going to go into the nitty-gritty of how the police department does its day-to-day work, I guess I have some questions about that. But I do know the subcommittee that's already working on the police headquarters is looking at options for funding for the police headquarters. And maybe when that comes back to council in a few weeks, this could be part of that conversation about, do we want to look at other funding sources to look at a police headquarters, but also for public safety in general. And to me, that's where I want to start before I say, okay, let's start another subcommittee. Because it sounds like there might be a logical offset from that conversation that's already in place. So that was my rambling. One last thing, and it has to do with public safety as well. I would like to see the county is going through some major issues with their budget, and some of the things that are being proposed for cuts, I think, are going to have huge negative effects on our day-to-day observations in the city. And we don't know yet what the County Board of Supervisors are going to do with their budget, and we won't for another few weeks. My point being, some of the cuts that are in there may have an effect on other individuals falling through the cracks and ending up on State Street homeless or something like that. And what does that then do to our economic vitality? What does that do to our calls for service? One example, if you haven't followed it, it's really, I didn't even know it existed. There's a organization, a program called ProPay that's under Harry Hagan's, the treasurer's office, that it's not a mandated position. What it does, as I understand it, it's county staff who assist mentally ill individuals who receive entitlement funds like General Relief or SSI or SSDI, help them figure out how to pay their rent, how to get food, assisting them with the monies that they get from other public agencies. The thought being, without that assistance, that money might go into some bank account, and someone who might not be able to assess how to best spend that money will spend it on other things and end up losing, getting evicted from their home or not getting fed or whatever else is going on. That is one program that is being slated for elimination entirely by the county, and I think would have an impact on our day-to-day observations in the city. Should that happen, and there may be other programs like that, I'd like to see maybe a conversation with county or something like that in the fall or after those decisions been made about what that impact is on the city. And it's kind of hard to quantify, but I think we're going to need to look at that as those programs get completely changed around or perhaps eliminated. But I just want to put that out today because I think it relates to the conversation we're having about officers and restorative policing and interaction, coordination with other services, because when those other services go away, it might also show how important Rental Housing Mediation Task Force is. If there's other things there that might might result in additional evictions or things like that. So I think we need to think about that as a council in a little bit. But now is not the time, and we have to see what the county's going to do, and I don't envy their position. We're in a much better position than they are, but what happens to them will impact us. Okay, so those are my comments. I'm sorry I rambled on a little bit, but I think you got that sense. Mr. White, you had your light on.
Thank you. And I didn't ramble on so much in my comments. I missed one piece that you hit on, but I'd like to at least sort of synthesize thoughts that come from several of my colleagues. First of all, Ms. Self made the point of you get what you pay for, and you should pay for what you get. Mr. Rouse spoke about the essence of this city is keeping it safe, clean, and green, and that we must do this if we're going to be attracting and keeping folks coming here. One of the slides that Mr. Samario put up showed that the city is now spending 55% of our general fund on public safety, and that's up. Was a chart that was passed along to us about a few days ago. That's up from 45% some 10 years ago, when we had 150 sworn. So even with we're giving more, a higher proportion of our general fund is going toward public safety. We are still making that a higher priority than everything else, to the to the pain of, in particular, of course, our parks and rec, our parks, and our library system. So that we are really already making a huge sacrifice for our public safety. Our mayor mentioned the subcommittee for the police building. We will have a report on that in a few weeks. We have a police headquarters which is not adequate, and we've been looking at not only its inadequacies and what we can do about it, but how to fund its replacement, and conceivably how to add positions for public safety going forward, so that some of these synergies may come together in that conversation in a few weeks. But we do need to pay for what we get, and we may need to put something to our citizens asking for that extra funding. But already this city has made a huge commitment to public safety, an increasing commitment each year, and I don't even know how city funding compares today as it did 10, 20 years ago, sort of in Mr. Armstrong's career, about proportion of local GDP, or how that kind of sort of relative cost of local government to what is produced in the region. Obviously, Prop 13 is at the foundation of some of that shift, and I think it's almost like Mr. Francisco's speculation about why the homeless are here. I suspect that Prop 13 issue is part of what is at the foundation of the starving of our parks and, of course, of our schools. So, but one issue will be coming back, and that is the police building, and conceivably an opportunity to increase the number of positions and a way to fund that over the next 10, 20, or 30 years. So I look forward to having that conversation, and that'll be my bit of rambling, Madam Mayor, on that topic. Thank you.
Mr. Francisco.
Thank you. We've been talking a little bit about the structural deficit in the city budget, and I agree that's a huge issue. And it's certainly true that law enforcement is a lot more expensive now than it was 20 years ago. Part of that due to changes in 1999 in PERS. The retirement costs for police officers are steadily escalating. There's no doubt about that. We have a general problem in California, locally, at the county level and at the state level, with pay and benefits for public employees outstripping those of the people in the private sectors who are paying the taxes to support these services. So we as a council, over the next few years, are going to be faced with some very tough decisions. I think it's inevitable what we're seeing around the state and city after city as fiscal reality hits is that we are going to end up with, there's going to have to be pension reform. Salaries are going to have to be brought more in line with what the private sector pays for the same services. We are undoubtedly going to move towards a two-tier system in which new employees are not going to get the same incredible benefit packages that current employees have. If we don't do something like that, eventually the pension system in this state will go bankrupt. There's absolutely no question about that. So we have a huge ongoing structural deficit problem, as does virtually every other city in this state, that we're going to be forced to work on. But we're not going to accomplish that in this budget. We're not going to accomplish that in this negotiating cycle with the bargaining units. This is going to be, we got into this mess over a period of years, and that's going to take years to get out of it. And I'm absolutely dedicated to looking at those problems realistically, and I feel confident that my fellow council members will approach that problem with the same realism. Nonetheless, despite the problems we have, and I've talked about this before, with steadily escalating PERS costs, especially for our safety employees, we still need to provide those services. And so I will, in the absence of a better suggestion, and I do believe that we need to establish a subcommittee soon to look at police department operational and budget issues over the long haul. This is not just for this budget cycle. But in the absence of a better number, I'm going to suggest 2 years ago our authorized sworn strength was 140. And I'm going to suggest, and I didn't feel like we had too many police officers back then, I'm going to suggest that we shoot for a target in this budget cycle of an authorized strength of 141. And I think it's not where we need to be, but I think it's a good step in the right direction. And I'm looking forward, Mr. Armstrong, to working with you and working with staff to come up with a way to pay for that. It may entail reductions in other departments. I understand that. But again, public safety is our first priority. And as Mr. Rouse points out, and this is so true, so much of this city's revenue, the money that's going out there that's supporting detox centers and our various festivals and community events, essential public services like a library. That money is coming from sales tax, it's coming from property tax, it's coming from our hotel bed tax. All of those sources of revenue are dependent on Santa Barbara continuing to be a wonderful, attractive place, both for residents and for the people who visit us. And I believe, as Mr. Rouse does, that increasing, you can call it the perception if you wish, but increasing public safety in our public spaces is absolutely essential to protecting that investment and, in the long run, increasing the revenue that allows us to do all the things we want to do. So anyway, that's what I would throw out as a target for the coming fiscal year, increasing, going along with all of the suggestions, all the excellent suggestions that we've had about the use of RDA funds, civilianization. Those are all great. And I would also suggest that we choose a target for this coming fiscal year of 141 as the authorized sworn strength in the police department.
I have a question for Mr. Armstrong. I mean, in order to do that for this budget, we have to figure out where it's coming from now, don't we?
Yes, I think you do, and I think, and it may be, we will probably, when we hire these 9 folks and send them to the academy in the next few months, we'll be well above your 141 for a while. But what I'm concerned about is in the long term, that's basically another $450,000 that we need to budget for, and in my mind, that's going to add to your structural deficit unless we find a place to reduce or new revenues to make it up. In the short term, you'll get there, because of just the overhiring process we're going to use, and we'll cover part of that through that $200,000 of appropriated reserve that we think we need just to do that. But if you want to budget for that in the long term, we already budget for salary savings. We have that thing we call the variance in there. So we already try and figure out when we have vacancies and turnover, and in the other departments that pretty much comes true. And because we've been overhiring in the police department, we're cutting it very, very close. I think if you want to set that as a target, we still need to figure out how do we pay for it, and then not just, I mean, next year we probably are okay. It's fiscal year 2013. When we still have to pay the piper on that $2.7 million structural deficit, and how we figure that out.
So I'm not quite sure how we get from point A to point B, Mr. Francisco, without figuring out a funding source today to pay for it, to put it into this next fiscal year's budget.
I disagree. We're going to have to get to this target. And if that means reductions in other departments, that's something, as Mr. Armstrong said, this is not a problem we're going to face overnight, because the costs of adding that authorized strength does not start July 1st.
But you have to budget for it.
We will budget for it, but we may not get there immediately. And we will have to reduce positions if need be in other departments. Mr. Armstrong presented us with a set of things that we can do if we decide that we want to increase authorized strength. What I'm saying is we will need to do those things. We certainly won't be able to do them today, because what we would be talking about is a reorganization. We will have to find other places in the budget to cut in order to support this in the long haul. There's no question about that. But we're not going to be faced with these increases overnight. We have time to figure out where else in the organization we can save money.
How would that look in the budget, Mr. Armstrong? Would that make it $450,000 unbalanced budget as of July 1, assuming by June 30th we'd find the $450,000?
We would, yeah. One way to do it would be to budget reserves or use up most of the appropriated. You've got $430,000 there of appropriated reserves. Now, this issue.
But that's one-time money, right?
That's one-time money. And it's the ongoing that you've got to be concerned about, because we've got this structural deficit we've got to deal with. And, I mean, if you make it 141 and you say budget out of here, but I think in the long term you've got to find out where you're going to cut, where you want to cut, and then more importantly, or revenues. And again, we have to deal not just with the 450, we have to deal with the larger problem, because this really makes it a $3.1 million problem.
You mean the deficit from 2.7 to 3.1? Okay. Let me make a suggestion since it's noon. There are some things I think we were in agreement over completely, which or in complete agreement, which was dealing with the rental housing mediation task force, because you need a motion on that, and you need a motion on at least the restorative policing additional amounts there, and the use of RDA funds for the Chase Palm Park. We have to give direction. What you have up here. Okay. So if we have agreement on these items, and the third bullet down, I would suggest having that extra 6 months, however you want to deal with it in the budget, and we'll come back and all that. But I think that's implicit in that. So why don't we take care of this first, so you have that direction, and then if we want to have discuss further this 141 authorized positions, we can continue doing that. Is there a motion for the items up on the screen here? Mr. House.
Yes, Madam Mayor, I think you get the right approach here. I agree with you, and I think that we can go forward with this. And I move that we approve staff recommendations to the budget and the bullets that you have up there, with the enhancement to the third bullet that you just talked about.
Right. Okay. Is there a second?
Second.
Okay. Any other discussion on that? Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Okay. So you got that. So
and
we want.
Madam Mayor, I just wanted to.
Yes, Mr. House.
I know this. What Mr. Francisco brings up is a very big conversation, and it's very deep. I don't think we have the time right now to I mean, we could, but we have other things we need to do. One of the things I know that the chief and the other department heads have done is they've been very mindful of one another's priorities and how important all this is to put together. And I am, we can have this conversation maybe at the next meeting or something, but I just got to say to everyone here, I think we would be doing a grave harm to our community in the budget if we were to go forward with this kind of recommendation. We're going to have, Chief, with your proposal, we will have more law enforcement officers, actually visibly, and personnel, like the outreach workers you're talking about, on the street than we've had in 10 years, at least.
Well,
actually operationally out there doing the work.
At times, remember, we're anticipating at least 5 more vacancies before January 1. Retirements and other issues where we're going to be down immediately the next few months. So even with the 9, if we put them in the academy and assuming they all make it through, we'll already, by the time they get out of the academy, those 5 anticipated vacancies would have already happened again. So we're back down. When we were at 151 10 years ago prior to me, we never had 151. We had an authorized strength of 151.
Right.
We didn't have 151 employees.
Exactly.
So the answer is yes and no. For a time period, for a few months, we'll have more.
You brought us up to 137 with what's coming through.
Right.
Which we haven't had for how long?
Quite a while.
Okay. And with this proposal, we'll be at 138 authorized. And with the shifts, we'll have 2 more that will be available for the street. And you'll have 9 non-sworn actually doing jobs that are distinct, freeing up your other folks to do other things as well.
Well, the 9 folks that are going to be coming on board with the restorative policing piece, none of that is being done by sworn right now.
Okay, so it's new services that people have been asking for.
Well, it's going to be an enhancement of the restorative policing program, and that's all it's going to do. It's not going to increase or decrease response times because they're not going to be dealing with those types of issues. These people will
be dealing with the issues that are on like State Street and Milpas and down at the beach and the things that people have been really telling us about.
Correct. But in terms of the numbers on the street, we're at, our maximum strength and patrol is 50. We're about at 47, 48 today, healthy folks working. So our functional strength is pretty close to where we should be. But there are other things we're not doing that we need to get to.
Okay.
But as we talk about, Councilman Francisco mentioned a subcommittee to see our operation. Well, quite frankly, and I know he wasn't criticizing us, I know that. But, currently, especially we had a meeting yesterday, we've identified 5 things that we need to work on the next fiscal year in terms of operations. We've already started to work on the paperwork issue that some of the officers want to get away from. We're going to start that probably in July. So we're working towards that, and we have people working on how we do business better. But it doesn't take away the fact that clearly, yes, we've got some graduating later this month. We have 9 we'd love to send to the academy. But in the interim, of the ones we know about, we're going to have 5 vacancies.
I guess Chief, and I really appreciate you taking the time to answer these questions. If you have an authorization for 138, as you're recommending, along with the other folks that are doing these other services, you have that authorization, and you're working as hard as you can to fill those positions. With that authorization, what holds you back from getting as close to that number as, just like you've done recently? Is there anything that would be different from what you have right now in your effort to actually fill those positions? Here's my problem. If we authorize 141 or some number larger, we're going to be hurting other programs in the city. You're going to still be pushing as hard as you can to recruit to fill your positions that are vacant or coming vacant, right? You're not going to hold back. And you're going to do that now. And then we have the money to be able to deal with these other programs. So you're at 100. I support your recommendation, I guess, is the first thing. Why is it that that's like some deficiency? You're going to be filling those as much as you possibly can with 138. What's the difference?
Well, first of all, I know the word is recommended budget, but I clearly would love more people. That's clear. I think everybody knows that. What we have failed to do as a police department or get to, we have 1 beat coordinator. I'd love to fill those because it helps the community.
And we all would.
We have 1 doing the entire city. When in the world is he going to get to everything that comes to our offices, issues and concerns and complaints when you have 1 person for the entire city? You can't do it. It's ridiculous. We don't have a Pell officer. We don't have a DARE officer. We all agree that those are important things. Those are the types of things that are important to us. But we have to cut back on that. We're always going to work hard and do the best we can. Clearly, my folks are not lazy people, and they're addressing every call to the best of their ability.
But the 138, what is that? Does that allow us to do some of that? Add another beat coordinator from the one we've got, or two?
No, it doesn't, because when I get that extra body, I'm putting them back in patrol, because our first job is boots on the ground, answer the call for service of our community. When the one person designated to restorative policing clearly is going to be designated restorative policing, which would be our second officer. But that the body that we get, the 138 number, is going to go in a police car to answer calls for service. That is our number one objective. That is our number one duty, and we have to address that first. I am not going to put a DARE officer back. I'm not going to put a PAL officer back, because we need people on the ground answering calls for service and investigating crime. Beyond that, our needs are beat coordinators, because they address one of the biggest things that all of you have talked to me about: quality of life issues that are addressed long before they become a crime issue. And over the years, when we had beat coordinators, a lot of those things stopped crime from ever even popping up. Well, quite frankly, much of the reason for crime popping up is because we have not had beat coordinators. Yet they weren't doing enforcement, they were doing the community policing piece that prevented it and enhanced community partnerships. Yeah. We have not had that for almost 4 years.
Okay, so I'm taking your point. Now I'm looking at your budget, and you're recommending 9 non-sworn. They're about half the cost, each one about half the cost of a sworn officer. Okay. So why aren't we taking maybe 2 or 4 of those and making them into sworn officers and meeting that next level?
Well, because quite frankly, I think the priority right now are the quality of life issues on Milpas and State Street and the beaches. And we need these individuals. I think these individuals are going to do a great job in partnership with us. I think it saves money by doing it with the non-sworn. And I think we get more bang for our buck. And I think it's a great solution to a lot of the issues that we have. And I think they're going to be an asset to us, whether just because they're not sworn.
Another beat coordinator or 2 beat coordinators, or the 4 outreach workers. You prefer the 4 outreach workers?
I do. At this point, I do. Because right now, the issue on State Street in our business community, at the hotels and motels on the beach, in our parks, at our schools, on the Milpas corridor, that is a huge issue. And a lot of that is not really an arrest issue, because we're never going to arrest ourselves out of this predicament. We need the outreach workers who are going to be able to assist us, you see, because when we have an outreach worker that's going to be able to transport people to Santa Monica, Bakersfield, Los Angeles, I'm not going to put a guy that makes with benefits way over $100,000 to transport people from Santa Barbara to Santa Monica. It just doesn't make any sense. And at the same time, those partnerships and well-trained people that are going to assist us as the outreach workers, I think are going to make a great impact on the other nonprofits as a partnership. And I think that's where we need to go. Because just because it's called community policing doesn't mean that the police have to do it all. The community has to assist us in doing it all. And I think bringing in the non-sworn hourly outreach workers that will be thoroughly trained and work for us at the police department, I think will impact greatly what we do. That said, on the other side, if we go to 141, we've got at least 2 beat coordinators there, maybe the DARE officer back, and another person in patrol. Mm-hmm. And I think that is going to be part of the solution, to get back to our beat coordinators that made such a great impact. When I arrived here, we had 6. 1 for each beat. I have 1 for the entire city, and I think that's I think that has to be a priority.
I agree strongly about the importance of beat coordinators. I just want to say what you just gave us a minute ago was the reason why I support your recommended budget and why I support it with the outreach workers in there. And I think you're on the right track completely with that. I just think for administrator, we need to find some way as the economy comes back, as we get back, to actually have the resources to pay as you go, basically, and be able to do this without a detriment to the other departments. Those are equally as important in my eyes. And this, we do have a public safety, thank goodness, commitment to our community. And thank you, Chief, for the work you've done.
I think, well, I'll add, I think we're all saying 141 as a minimum if we want the beat coordinators back, we want the PAL officer back and the DARE officer back. And I think as a target, if that was the term being used earlier, I would agree with. My concern with just putting it in the budget now without knowing how we're going to pay for it in the long term troubles me. We need, and we can have that conversation after the budget's done and figure this out. I'm happy to do that. But to put it into the budget right now at a $450,000 cost, even if we said we're going to use all the appropriated reserves to make it balance out the budget, that's still one-time money, and then a year from now, we're going to, as was mentioned, our structural deficit's going to go up to $3.1 million, and we have to figure that out. Plus, we're in the middle of concessions with the public safety union that we're not going to be able to get more concessions out of, because that's the way the contract is. So we're tying our hands a year from now. However, if we want to say, yes, agree that we want to have a target in the next 12 to 18 months to go from 138 to 141 and figure out how to pay for it, and let's figure out how to do that, I'm fine having that conversation. I just have I just don't think it's fiscally responsible for us to plug that money into a budget without knowing how in the long term we're going to pay for it. And as I said before, I don't want to authorize a position now and then a pink slip a year from now. And that's really not a position I want to be in.
Madam Mayor, one suggestion I'd make, and I don't like doing it in the long term, but in the past we have had authorized but unfunded positions in the budget, and we can put 3 authorized but unfunded positions in. In the next 6 months, it really won't make any difference because we will be actually above 141. Even with the 5 people who leave, we'll actually be over that. And then if you want to schedule another session after the budget's adopted, we can come back and we can have more discussion on how to find the 450. I mean, because you do have that luxury in terms of the way the hiring process works, but you're still going to have the tough discussion at some point in the future.
Well, that's a little easier. I mean, it is kind of a strange conversation to have here when I think Carpinteria just cut a number of deputies, so did City of Goleta, the Sheriff's Department. I mean, the amount of cuts is tremendous. So, I mean, it's a good problem that we're having here with this debate, considering where everyone else is. But I think that might help me anyway in terms of trying to move forward if we want to figure out something today. Ms. Self and then Mr. Francisco.
Thank you. I believe in last year's budget cycle, we had, say, funded something at 6 months down the road. Not now, right? Since it wasn't placed, didn't we use that where the funding right now for a position didn't happen until 6 months?
I don't recall doing that. We may have. Mr. Samario?
I think it had to do with the police department. But is that an option? Which is more or less what you're saying. It's an unfunded, allocated but unfunded.
I think eventually if you want to have an authorized strength of 141, you need to fund it for the whole. There are savings when you bring people in. We actually budget, with the different steps that people are at. We're pretty precise on the salary side other than when the vacancies are there. But if we're going to, because I think one of the things we've learned with police staffing is we're going to need in the long term to continue to overhire just to try and be closer to what to get that functional strength closer to the authorized strength. That's been a challenge for us, all the time, and it hasn't been uncommon for us to have 10, 15 vacancies in the police department in the past. So we're always going to have to do that. We're going to have to figure out a way to pay for it, and we could do it for 6 months. You still, at some point, you have to deal with the whole cost.
Right. No, I recognize that. And I like Mr. Francisco's idea of setting up an ad hoc committee to review this, and the salary information that he asks for, so we have an ongoing idea of what we're doing. And what kind of rung a little bell in my head about the necessity to get to higher levels is we have cold crimes that aren't being investigated. If you know anybody who has been in a crime, and to think that we aren't even investigating a solution to that, I find that equally, if not more, horrendous than having no one show up for a crime in progress by not having enough force. So, there are a lot of complex issues, and I really appreciate how we seem to be coming together and solving it. But I think 141 would be a good target.
Francisco.
Thank you. I was going to move that we direct Mr. Armstrong and staff to come back to us with a suggestion in the next budget hearing on how to cover that 450 expenditure. But I'm also comfortable with Mr. Armstrong's suggestion that we go forward with this, increase the authorized strength to 141, currently unfunded. That'll give us more time to come up with a rational solution. I'm committed to, obviously, to finding a way to pay for it. We have to pay for it. But it would be better if we didn't have to do that within 2 weeks. That will give us more time to come up with a rational solution. I think that it sounds to me as if everyone here agrees that an increased police staff is a necessity, and the only question is, how do we pay for it? And the reason that the authorized sworn strength is so important, that's the target that we're aiming for. I realize we're not always going to be there. There are just unpredictable events that happen, more retirements than you thought were going to happen, more people out on injury than you thought, more than normal. But we have to have that authorized sworn strength as a target. We may not reach it on any given week, but having that target there allows us to put the right number of people in the academy, for instance. Overhiring is great, and I hope we end up above that number in our actual strength in the field, but there's a good chance that we won't, because historically we haven't. Historically, we've very, very rarely hit with the actual number of officers out there in the field the number that we're authorized to have. So that's why I think that number is so vital. And I think that having more time working with city staff, working with the police chief to figure out how we're going to pay for that is great. So I would like to move that we go forward with 141 authorized sworn strength as our target for the police department. As Mr. Armstrong suggested, unfunded in this current budget. And we'll have some months ahead of us to figure out where in the ongoing budget, because these costs don't start overnight, where in the ongoing budget that money is going to come from.
Second.
Okay, is there, Mr. Hotchkiss?
No, I think he's right. Let's go forward with it and call a question.
Okay, any other discussion on this?
What's the process, Madam Mayor, for determining where the money's going to come from? I don't understand.
I think it's to be determined, but I think the point of today is to put in the budget document 3 additional sworn officer positions that's unfunded, but in the budget document. I mean, that's really what we're just doing today.
Well, Madam Mayor, the word target is what was used in the motion, and the target is different from authorized strength. And I think that's important to say that out loud. You've got other departments here who are then going to be wondering, do I really have what I just got budgeted, or do I not? Is there going to be a mid-year review, revised or something that we go back and start taking from other departments? Well, how do we do that?
What I would anticipate is in the budget document there's a page that says the summary of positions. We would increase that by 3 in the police department. There would be an asterisk, and then there would be at the bottom of the asterisk it would say 3 positions unfunded. Then we would come to you in July, and we'd have another discussion like this. And the first thing I would ask you is, what process do you want to use? Because you need to give us direction on what your priorities are if you want to make mid-budget corrections. I think you'll also have a little more information in terms of the police remodel and whether or not you want to take advantage of those discussions as well. So we'd schedule it after that. But at this point, it would be unfunded, and we wouldn't fund them until we receive direction from you. But in the meantime, because we're already planning to overhire for the next academy, we're going to bring in 9. We're currently 137. We're going to bring on 9. That gets you to 146. If we have 5 folks retire in the next 6 months, you're still ahead of the game. And then, so you have a little time to make those, to give us that direction. But I wouldn't be making any adjustments to anybody else's budget until I had 4 votes that said this is what we want to do.
But Madam Mayor and Mr. Armstrong, it would be right now. I mean, the way we did it last few years, we used unappropriated reserves that were
To actually fund it and hire. That's the difference. That's the difference. The difference is by having them be unfunded, we're not authorizing the chief. We're authorizing the chief to overhire over 138. We're going to have a discussion of how to pay for 141, but we're not authorizing the chief to overhire beyond the 141. We're only authorizing to overhire beyond the 138. So there's no cuts to other department budgets as of July 1.
Okay.
There could be in the future when we figure out where the $450,000 ongoing
or as
funds are
Mr.
going to
Francisco
happen.
suggested, go into reserves or do
Or
something else.
Whatever the process is, but that is not what we're deciding today. And I'll also add there could be other revenue sources if that's really what we want to look at as well, but we don't know that yet. Right. That's right. Mr. Rouse?
A question for Mr. Francisco. Was an ad hoc committee, a subcommittee part of that motion?
No.
Because I think the suggestion is to come back after the police headquarters discussion to figure out what process
It'd be our
we should take.
intention. We'll come back, just have a discussion about process to fund an additional 3 police officers and get some direction whether or not you want to have a subcommittee, whether or not you want to have the finance committee look at it, you want to have the police building committee, and we can go from there.
Chief?
Just a quick reminder that we've applied for a grant for 6 officers, non-matching funds. And that news from Washington will come out second week of August as to who gets that. This year, with this funding, it is non-matching, which is great. And second of all, they are considering those departments who were denied in the last 3 years, which we were one of those that were denied for the last 3 years. So the number of cities has dwindled for the funds. So we'll keep our fingers crossed. And if that dream comes true, then this meeting is a moot point. But we'll see what happens with that. But I just wanted
How
to
many
remind
years
you.
is that grant?
Pardon me?
For how many years is that grant?
5 years.
5 years.
5 years,
Okay.
6 officers. So we'll keep our fingers crossed. I'm an optimist, and we'll just keep hoping for the best. But we did apply for that, and I wanted to remind you of that. We said that last month to you.
Any other questions on the motion? All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed?
No.
Okay, is that 6-1? Before we go, sorry, I meant to bring up, ask my colleagues about the Mesa Lane Steps option, if that's something we want to consider or not, and if it's not, that's fine, but I wanted just to close the loop on that. I didn't hear from...
Madam Mayor, would it be okay to consider that at our next budget session? I'm not really clear on all the priorities that the Parks and Rec Commission has.
Could you bring that item back on Monday after the solid waste or before the solid waste?
Sure, we can bring it back then.
Okay, and we can make a final determination. Thank you for that. Okay, thank you. This meeting's adjourned.